Space Viking by H. Beampiper, Part 1. They stood together at the parapet, their arms about each other's waists, her head against his cheek. Behind, the broad-leaved shrubbery gossiped softly with the wind, and from the lower main terrace came music and laughing voices. The city of Wardshaven spread in front of them, white buildings rising from the wide spaces of green treetops, under a shimmer of sun-reflecting aircars above. Far away, the mountains were violet in the afternoon haze, and the huge red sun hung in a sky as yellow as a ripe peach. His eye caught a twinkle 10 miles to the southwest, and for an instant he was puzzled. Then he frowned. The sunlight on the 2,000-foot globe of Duke Angus' new ship, the Enterprise, back at the Gorham shipyards after her final trial cruise. He didn't want to think about that now. Instead, he pressed the girl close and whispered her name, Elaine, and then, caressing every syllable, Lady Elaine Trask of Traskin. "Oh no, Lucas?" Her protest was half joking and half apprehensive. "It's bad luck to be called by your married name before the wedding. I've been calling you that in my mind since the night of the Duke's ball, when you were just home from school on Excalibur." She looked up from the corner of her eye. "That was when I started calling me." "That too," she confessed. "There's a terrace to the west at Traskin new house," he told her. "Tomorrow we'll have our dinner there and watch the sunset together." "I know. I thought that was to be our sunset watching place. You have been peeking," he accused. "Traskin new house was to be your surprise." "I always was a present peeker, New Year's and my birthdays, but I only saw it from the air. I'll be very surprised at everything inside," she promised. And very delighted. And when she'd seen everything and Traskin new house wasn't a surprise anymore, they'd take a long space trip. He hadn't mentioned that to her yet. To some of the other sword worlds, Excalibur, of course, and Morglay and Flamberge and Durandal. No, not Durandal. The war had started there again, but they'd have so much fun. And she would see clear blue skies again and stars at night. The cloud veil hid the stars from Graham, and Elaine had missed them since coming home from Excalibur. The shadow of an aircar fell briefly upon them, and they looked up and turned their heads, in time to see it sink with graceful dignity toward the landing stage of Karvall House, and he glimpsed its blazonry, sword and atom symbol, the badge of the ducal house of Ward. He wondered if it were Duke Angus himself, or just some of his people come ahead of him. They should get back to their guests, he supposed. Then he took her in his arms and kissed her, and she responded ardently. It must have been all of 5 minutes since they'd done that before. A slight cough behind them brought them apart and their heads around. It was Cesar Karvall, gray-haired and portly, the breast of his blue coat gleaming with orders and decorations, and the sapphire in the pommel of his dress dagger twinkling. "I thought I'd fie." "And you too here," Elaine's father smiled. "You'll have tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow together, but need I remind you that today we have guests and more coming every minute." "Who came in the Ward car?" Elaine asked. "Ravard Groffes. And Otto Harkaman. You never met him, did you, Lucas?" "No, not by introduction. I'd like to before he spaces out." He had nothing against Harkaman personally, only against what he represented. "Is the Duke coming?" "Oh, surely. Lionel of New Haven and the Lord of Northport are coming with him. They're at the palace now." Karvall hesitated. "His nephew's back in town." Elaine was distressed. She started to say, "Oh dear, I hope he doesn't. Has Dunnan been bothering Elaine again?" "Nothing to take notice of. He was here yesterday, demanding to speak with her. We got him to leave without too much unpleasantness." "It'll be something for me to take notice of if he keeps it up after tomorrow." For his seconds and Andray Dunnan's, he hoped it wouldn't come to that. He didn't want to have to shoot a kinsman to the House of Ward and a crazy man to boot. "I'm terribly sorry for him," Elaine was saying. "Father, you should have let me talk to him. I might have made him understand." Cesar Karvall was shocked. "Child, you couldn't have subjected yourself to that? The man is insane." Then he saw her bare shoulders and was even more shocked. "Elaine, your shawl?" Her hands went up and couldn't find it. She looked about in confused embarrassment. Amused, Lucas picked it from the shrub onto which she had tossed it and draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering briefly. Then he gestured to the older man to precede them, and they entered the arbored walk. At the other end, an open circle, A fountain played, white marble girls and boys bathing in the jade-green basin. Another piece of loot from one of the old Federation planets. That was something he'd tried to avoid in furnishing Trask and new house. There'd be a lot of that coming to Graham after Otto Harkaman took the Enterprise to space. "I'll have to come back sometime and visit them," Elaine whispered to him. "They'll miss me. You'll find a lot of friends at your new home," he whispered back. "You wait till tomorrow. I'm going to put a word in the Duke's ear about that fellow," Cesar Karvall, still thinking of Dunnan, was saying. "If he speaks to him, maybe it'll do some good. I doubt it. I don't think Duke Angus has any influence over him at all." Dunnan's mother had been the Duke's younger sister. From his father he had inherited what had originally been a prosperous bara. Now it was mortgaged to the top of the manor house aerial mast. The Duke had once assumed Dunnan's debts and refused to do so again. Dunnan had gone to space a few times as a junior officer on trade Andrade voyages into the old Federation. He was supposed to be a fair astrogator. He had expected his uncle to give him command of the Enterprise, which had been ridiculous. Disappointed in that, he had recruited a mercenary company and was seeking military employment. It was suspected that he was in correspondence with his uncle's worst enemy, Duke Omfrey of Glasspythe, and he was obsessively in love with Elaine Karvall, a passion which seemed to nourish itself on its own hopelessness. Maybe it would be a good idea to take that space trip right away. There ought to be a ship leaving Bigalasport for one of the other sword worlds before long. They paused at the head of the escalators. The garden below was thronged with guests, the bright shawls of the ladies and the coats of the men making shifting color patterns among the flower beds and on the lawns and under the trees. Serving robots, flame yellow and black in the Karvall colors, floated about playing soft music and offering refreshments. There was a continuous spiral of changing costume color around the circular robo-table. Voices babbled happily. Like a mountain river, as they stood looking down, another aircar circled low, green and gold lettered Pamplanet news service. Cesar Karvall swore in irritation. "Didn't there used to be something they called privacy?" he asked. "It's a big story, Cesar." It was, more than the marriage of two people who happened to be in love with each other. It was the marriage of the farming and ranching barony of Traskin and the Karvall steel mills. More, it was public announcement that the wealth and fighting men of both baronies were now aligned behind Duke Angus of Wardshaven. So it was a general holiday. Every industry had closed down at noon today, and would be closed until morning after next, and there would be dancing in every park and feasting in every tavern. To sword-worlders, any excuse for a holiday was better than none. There are people, Cesar. They have a right to have a good time with us. I know everybody at Traskin is watching this by screen. He raised his hand and waved to the news car, and when it swung its pickup around, he waved again. Then they went down the long escalator. Lady Elaine Karvall was the center of a cluster of matrons and dowagers, around which tomorrow's bridesmaids fluttered like many-colored butterflies. She took possession of her daughter and dragged her into the feminine circle. He's all Robert Groffy's, small and saturnine, Duke Angus henchman, and Bert Sandrassen, Lady Lavina's brother. They spoke, and then an upper servant, his tabard blazoned with the yellow flame and black hammer of Karvall Mills, approached his master with some tale of domestic crisis, and the two went away together. "You haven't met Captain Harkaman, Lucas," Robert Groffy said. "I wish you'd come over and say hello and have a drink with him. I know your attitude, but he's a good sort. Personally, I wish we had a few like him around here." That was his main objection. There were fewer and fewer men of that sort on any of the sword worlds. A dozen men clustered around the bartending robot, his cousin and family lawyer, Nicolai Trask, Lothar F. Fail, the banker, Alex Gorham, the shipbuilder, and his son Basil, Baron Rathmore, more of the Wardshaven nobles whom he knew only distantly, and Otto Harkaman. Harkaman was a Space Viking. That would have set him apart, even if he hadn't topped the tallest of them by a head. He wore a short black jacket, heavily gold-braided, and black trousers inside ankle boots. The dagger on his belt was no mere dress ornament. His tousled red-brown hair was long enough to furnish extra padding in a combat helmet, and his beard was cut square at the bot. He had been fighting on Durandal, for one of the branches of the royal house contesting fratricidally for the throne. The wrong one, he had lost his ship, and most of his men, and almost his own life. He had been a penniless refugee on Flamberge, owning only the clothes he stood in and his personal weapons, and the loyalty of half a dozen adventurers as penniless as himself, when Duke Angus had invited him to Graham to command the Enterprise. A pleasure, Lord Trask. I've met your lovely bride-to-be, and now that I meet you, let me congratulate both. Then, as they were having a drink together, he put his foot in it by asking, "You're not an investor in the Tanith adventure, are you?" He said he wasn't, and would have let it go at that. Young Basil Gorham had to get his foot in, too. Lord Trask does not approve of the Tanith adventure, he said scornfully. He thinks we should stay home and produce wealth, instead of exporting robbery and murder to the old Federation for it. The smile remained on Otto Harkamen's face, only the friendliness was gone. He unobtrusively shifted his drink to his left hand. Well, our operations are definable as robbery and murder, he agreed. Space Vikings are professional robbers and murderers, and you object. Perhaps you find me personally objectiona. Bull, I wouldn't have shaken your hand or had a drink with you if I did. I don't care how many planets you raid or cities you sack, or how many innocents, if that's what they are, you massacre in the old Federation. You couldn't possibly do anything worse than those people have been doing to one another for the past 10 centuries. What I object to is the way you're raiding the Sword Worlds. You're crazy, Basil Gorham exploded. Young man. Harkamen reproved, the conversation was between Lord Trask and myself. And when somebody makes a statement you don't understand, don't tell him he's crazy. Ask him what he means. What do you mean, Lord Trask? You should know, you've just raided Graham for 800 of our best men. You raided me for close to 40 vaqueros, farm workers, lumbermen, machine operators, and I doubt I'll be able to replace them. With as good. He turned to the elder Gorham. Alex, how many have you lost to Captain Harkamen? Gorham tried to make it a dozen. Pressed, he admitted to a score and a half. Roboticians, machine supervisors, programmers, a couple of engineers, a foreman. There was grudging agreement from the others. Bert Sandrassen's engine works had lost almost as many of the same kind. Even Lothar F. Fail admitted to losing a computerman and a guard sergeant, and after they were gone, the farms and ranches and factories would go on, almost but not quite as before. Nothing on Graham, nothing on any of the Sword Worlds, was done as efficiently as 3 centuries ago. The whole level of Sword World life was sinking, like the east coastline of this continent, so slowly as to be evident only from the records and monuments of the past. He said as much and added, and the Jeanette. Ich loss. The best Sword World genes are literally escaping to space, like the atmosphere of a low-gravity planet, each generation begotten by fathers slightly inferior to the last. It wasn't so bad when the Space Vikings raided directly from the Sword Worlds. They got home once in a while. Now they're conquering planets in the old Federation for bases and staying there. Everybody had begun to relax. This wouldn't be a quarrel. Harkamen, who had shifted his drink back to his right hand, chuckled. That's right. I've fathered my share of brats in the old Federation, and I know Space Vikings whose fathers were born on old Federation planets. He turned to Basil Gorham. You see, the gentleman isn't crazy at all. That's what happened to the Terran Federation, by the way. The good men all left to colonize, and the stuffed shirts and yes-men and herd followers. And safety-firsters stayed on Terra and tried to govern the galaxy. Well, maybe this is all new to you, Captain, Ravard Groffy said sourly, but Lucas Trask's dirge for the decline and fall of the Sword Worlds is an old song to the rest of us. I have too much to do to stay here and argue. Lothar F. Fail evidently did intend to stay and argue. All you're saying, Lucas, is that we're expanding. You want us to sit here and build up population pressure like Terra in the 1st century. With 3.5 billion people spread out on 12 planets, they had that many on Terra alone, and it took us 8 centuries to reach that. That had been since the 9th century, atomic era, at the end of the Big War. 10,000 men and women on Abigar, refusing to surrender, had taken the remnant of the System States Alliance Navy to space, seeking a world the Federation had never heard of and wouldn't find for a long time. That had been the world they had called Excalibur. From it, their grandchildren had colonized Joyous and Durandal and Flamberge. Haltekler had been colonized in the next generation from Joyous, and Graham from Haltekler. We're not expanding, Lothar. We're contracting. We stopped expanding 350 years ago when that ship came back to Morglay from the old Federation and reported what had been happening out there since the Big War. Before that, we were discovering new planets and colonizing them. Since then, we've been picking the bones of the dead Terran Federation. Something was going on by the escalators to the landing stage. People were moving excitedly in that direction, and the news cars were circling like vultures over a sick cow. Harkaman wondered, hopefully, if it mightn't be a fight, some drunk being bounced. Nikolay, Lucas' cousin, commented, "Cesar's let all Wardshaven in here today. But Lucas, this Tanith adventure, we're not making any hit-and-run raid. We're taking over a whole planet. It'll be another sword world in 40 or 50 years. Inside another century, we'll conquer the whole Federation," Baron Rathmore declared. He was a politician and never let exaggeration worry him. "But I don't understand," Harkaman said, "is why you support Duke Angus, Lord Trask, if you think the Tanith adventure is doing Graham so much harm. If Angus didn't do it, somebody else would. But Angus is going to make himself king of Graham, and I don't think anybody else could do that. This planet needs a single sovereignty. I don't know how much you've seen of it outside this duchy, but don't take Wardshaven as typical. Some of these duchies, like Glasspythe or Didriksburg, are literal snake pits. All the major barons are at each other's throats, and they can't even keep their own knights and petty barons in order. Why, there's a miserable little war down in South Main Continent that's been going on for over 2 centuries. That's probably where Dunnan's going to take that army of his," a robot manufacturing baron said. "I hope it gets ipped out and Dunnan with it. You don't have to go to South Main, just go to Glasspythe," somebody else said. "Well, if we don't get a planetary monarchy to keep order, this planet will decivilize like anything in the old Federation." "Oh, come, Lucas," Alex Gorham protested. "That's pulling it out too far." "Yes, for one thing, we don't have the Neo-Barbarians," somebody said. "And if they ever came out here, we'd blow them too. MC square in nothing flat. Might be a good thing if they did, too. It would stop us squabbling among ourselves." Harkaman looked at him in surprise. "Just who do you think the Neo-Barbarians are, anyhow?" he asked. "Some race of invading nomads, Attila's Huns in spaceships?" "Well, isn't that who they are?" Gorham asked. "Niflheim, no, there aren't 12.5 planets in the old Federation that still have hyperdrive, and they are all civilized. That's if civilized is what Gilgamesh is," he added. "These are homemade barbarians. Workers and peasants who revolted to seize and divide the wealth, and then found they'd smashed the means of production and killed off all the technical brains. Survivors on planets hit during the interstellar wars, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, who lost the machinery of civilization. Followers of political leaders on local dictatorship planets, companies of mercenaries thrown out of employment and living by pillage, religious fanatics following self-anointed prophets. You think we don't have plenty of neo-barbarian material here on Graham? Trask demanded. If you do, take a look around. Glasspythe, somebody said. That collection of overripe gallows fruit Andray Dunnan's recruited, Rathmore mentioned. Alex Gorham was grumbling that his shipyard was full. Love them? Agitators stirring up trouble, trying to organize a strike to get rid of the robots. Yes, Harkaman pounced on that last. I know of at least 40 instances on 12.5 planets in the last 8 centuries of anti-technological movements. They had them on Terra back as far as the 2nd century pre-atomic. And after Venus seceded from the First Federation, before the Second Federation was organized. You're interested in history? Rathmore asked. A hobby. All spacemen have hobbies. There's very little work aboard ship in hyperspace. Boredom is the worst enemy. My guns and missiles officer, Van Larch, is a painter. Most of his work was lost with the Coruscant on Durandal, but he kept us from starving a few times on Flamberge by painting pictures and selling them. My hyperspatial astrogator, Gwat Kirby, composes music. He tries to express the mathematics of hyperspatial theory in musical terms. I don't care much for it myself, he admitted. I study history. You know, it's odd. Practically everything that's happened on any of the inhabited planets happened on Terra before the first spaceship. The garden immediately around them was quiet now. Everybody was over by the landing stage escalators. Harkaman would have said more, but at that moment he saw half a dozen of Cesar Karvall's uniformed guardsmen run past. They were helmeted and in bulletproofs. One of them had an auto rifle, and the rest carried knobbed plastic truncheons. The Space Viking set down his drink. "Let's go," he said. "Our host is calling up his troops. I think the guests ought to find battle stations, too." The gaily dressed crowd formed a semicircle facing the landing stage escala. Aiders, everybody was staring in embarrassed curiosity, those behind craning over the shoulders of those in front. The ladies had drawn up their shawls in frigid formality. Many had even covered their heads. There were 4 news service cars hovering above. Whatever was going on was getting a planet-wide screen showing. The Karvall guardsmen were trying to get through. Their sergeant was saying, over and over, "Please, ladies and gentlemen." "Your pardon, noble sir," and getting nowhere. Otto Harkaman swore disgustedly and shoved the sergeant aside. "Make way here," he bellowed. "Let these guards pass." With that, he almost hurled a gaily dressed gentleman aside on either hand. They both turned to glare angrily, then got hastily out of his way. Meditating briefly on the uses of bad manners in an emergency, Trask followed with the others. The big Space Viking plowed. To the front, where Cesar Karvall and Ravard Groffies and several others were standing. Facing them, 4 men in black cloaks stood with their backs to the escalators. 2 were common folk retainers, hired gunmen to be precise. They were at pains to keep their hands plainly in sight and seemed to be wishing themselves elsewhere. The man in front wore a diamond sunburst jewel on his beret, and his cloak was lined with pale blue silk. His thin, pointed face was deeply lined about the mouth and penciled with a thin black mustache. His eyes showed white all around the irises, and now and then his mouth would twitch in an involuntary grimace. Andray Dunnan. Trask wondered briefly how soon he would have to look at him from 25 meters over the sights of a pistol. The face of the slightly taller man who stood at his shoulder was paper-white, expressionless, with a black beard. His name was Neville Orme. Nobody was quite sure whence he had come, and he was Dunnan's henchman and constant companion. "You lie," Dunnan was shouting. "You lie damnably in your stinking teeth, all of you. You've intercepted every message she's tried to send me." "My daughter has sent you no messages, Lord Dunnan," Cesar Karvall said with forced patience. "None but the one I just gave you that she wants nothing whatever to do with." "You think I believe that? You're holding her a prisoner. Satan only knows how you've been torturing her to force her into this abominable marriage." There was a stir among the bystanders. That was more than well-mannered restraint could stand. Out of the murmur of incredulous voices, one woman's was quite audible. "Well, really, he actually is crazy," Dunnan, like everybody else, heard it. "Crazy am I," he blazed, "because I can see through this hypocritical sham. Here's Lucas Trask, he wants an interest in Karvall Mills. And here's Cesar Karvall, he wants access to iron deposits on Trascan land. And my loving uncle, he wants the help of both of them in stealing Omfrey of Glaspythe's duchy. And here's this loan shark of a F-fail, trying to claw my lands away from me. And Ravard Groffies, the fetch dog of my uncle who won't lift a finger to save. His kinsman from ruin, and this foreigner Harkaman who swindled me out of command of the Enterprise. You're all plotting against me." "Sir Neville," Groffies said, "you can see that Lord Dunnan's not himself. If you're a good friend to him, you'll get him out of here before Duke Angus arrives." Orme leaned forward and spoke urgently in Dunnan's ear. Dunnan pushed him angrily away. "Great Satan, are you against me too?" he demanded. Orme caught his arm. "You fool, do you want to ruin everything now?" He lowered his voice, the rest was inaudible. "No, curse you, I won't go till I've spoken to her, face to face." Dunnan interrupts wedding party. There was another stir among the spectators. The crowd was parting, and Elaine was coming through, followed by her mother and Lady Sandrassen and 5 or 6 other matrons. They all had their shawls over their heads, right end. Over left shoulders, they all stopped except Elaine, who took a few steps forward and confronted Andray Dunnan. He had never seen her look more beautiful, but it was the icy beauty of a honed dagger. "Lord Dunnan, what do you wish to say to me?" she asked. "Say it quickly and then go. You are not welcome here." "Elaine," Dunnan cried, taking a step forward. "Why do you cover your head? Why do you speak to me as a stray?" "Inger, I am Andray, who loves you. Why are you letting them force you into this wicked marriage?" "No one is forcing me. I am marrying Lord Trask willingly and happily because I love him. Now please go and make no more trouble at my wedding." "That's a lie. They're making you say that. You don't have to marry him. They can't make you. Come with me now." They won't dare stop you. I'll take you away from all these cruel, greedy people. You love me. You've always loved me. You've told me you loved me again and again. Yes, in his own private dream world, a world of fantasy that had now become Andray Dunnan's reality, in which an Elaine Karvall whom his imagination had created existed only to love him. Confronted by the real Elaine, he simply rejected the reality. I never loved you, Lord Dunnan, and I never told you so. I never hated you either. But you are making it very hard for me not to. Now go and never let me see you again. With that, she turned and started back through the crowd which parted in front of her. Her mother and her aunt and the other ladies followed. You lied to me, Dunnan shrieked after her. You lied all the time. You're as bad as the rest of them, all scheming and plotting against me, betraying me. I know what it's about. You all want to cheat me of my rights and keep my usurping uncle on the ducal throne. And you false-hearted harlot, you're the worst of them all. Sir Neville Orme caught his shoulder and spun him around, propelling him toward the escalators. Dunnan struggled, screaming inarticulately like a wounded wolf. Orme was cursing furiously. You too, he shouted. Help me here, get hold of him. Dunnan was still howling as they forced him onto the escalator, the backs of the two retainers' cloaks, badged with the Dunnan crescent, light blue on black, hiding him. After a little, an air car with the blue crescent blazonry lifted and sped away. Lucas, he's crazy, Cesar Karvall was insisting. Elaine hasn't spoken 50 words to him since he came back from his last voyage. He laughed and put a hand on Karvall's shoulder. I know that, Cesar. You don't think, do you, that? I need assurance of it. Crazy, I'll say he's crazy, Ravard Groffes put in. Did you hear what he said about his rights? Wait till his grace hears about that. Does he lay claim to the ducal throne, Sir Ravard? Otto Harkaman asked, sharply and seriously. Oh, he claims that his mother was born a year and a half before Duke Angus, and the true date of her birth falsified to give Angus the succession. Why, his present Grace was 3 years old when she was born. I was old Duke Fergus Esquire. I carried Angus on my shoulder when Andray Dunnan's mother was presented to the lords and barons the day after she was born. Of course he's crazy, Alex Gorham agreed. I don't know why the Duke doesn't have him put under psychiatric treatment. I'd put him under treatment, Harkaman said, drawing a finger across under his beard. Crazy men, who pretend to thrones are bombs that ought to be deactivated before they blow things up. We couldn't do that, Groffy said. After all, he's Duke Angus' nephew. I could do it, Harkaman said. He only has 300 men in this company of his. Why you people ever let him recruit them Satan only knows, he parenthesized. I have 800, 500 ground fighters. I'd like to see how they shape up in comb. Before we space out, I can have them ready for action in 2 hours, and it'd be all over before midnight. No, Captain Harkaman, his grace would never permit it, Groffes vetoed. You have no idea of the political harm that would do among the independent lords on whom we're counting for support. You weren't here on Graham when Duke Richard of Didriksburg had his sister Sancha's second husband poisoned. They halted under the colonnade. Beyond, the lower main terrace was crowded, and a medley of old love songs was wafting from the sound outlets for the 6th or 8th time around. He looked at his watch. It was 90 seconds later than the last time he had done so. Give it 15 more minutes to get started, and another 15 to get away after the marriage toasts and the felicitations. And no marriage, however pompous, lasted more than half an hour. Or then, till he and Elaine would be in the air car, bulleting toward Traskin. The love song stopped abruptly. After a momentary silence, a trumpet, considerably amplified, blared the ducal salute. The crowd stopped shifting. The buzz of voices ceased. At the head of the landing stage escalators, there was a glow of color, and the ducal party began moving down. A platoon of guards in red and yellow, with gilded helmets and tasseled hal. Birds, and a squire bearing the sword of state. Duke Angus with his council, Otto Harkaman among them, the Duchess Flavia and her companion ladies, the household gentlemen and their ladies, more guardsmen. There was a great burst of cheering. The news service air cars got into position above the procession. Cousin Nicolay and a few others stepped out from between the pillars into the sunlight. There was a similar movement at the other side of the terrace. The ducal party reached the end of the central walkway, halted and deployed. All right, let's shove off, Cousin Nicolay said, stepping forward. 10 minutes since they had come outside, another 5 to get into position. 50 minutes now till he and Elaine, Lady Elaine Trask of Traskin, for real and for always, would be going home. "Sure the car's ready?" he asked for the 100th time. His cousin assured him that it was. Figures. In Karvall, black and flame yellow appeared across the terrace. The music began again, this time the stately noble's wedding march, arrogant and at the same time tender. Cesar Karvall's gentleman secretary and the Karvall lawyer, executives of the steel mills, the Karvall guard captain. Cesar himself, with Elaine on his arm. She was wearing a shawl of black and yellow. He looked around in sudden fright. "For the love of Satan, where's our shawl?" he demanded, and then relaxed when one of his gentlemen exhibited it, green and tawny in Traskin colors. The bridesmaids, led by Lady Elaine Karvall. Finally they halted 10 yards apart in front of the Duke. "Who approaches us?" Duke Angus asked of his guard captain. He had a thin, pointed face, almost femininely sensitive, and a small, pointed beard. He was bareheaded except for the narrow golden circlet, which he spent most of his waking time scheming to convert into a royal crown. The guard captain repeated the question. "I am Sir Nicolay Trask. I bring my cousin and liege lord, Lucas, Lord Trask, Baron of Traskin. He comes to receive the Lady Demoiselle Elaine, daughter of Lord Cesar Karvall, Baron of Karvall Mills, and the sanction of your grace to the marriage between them." Sir Maximin Jorge, Cesar Karvall's henchman, named himself and his lord. They brought the Lady Demoiselle Elaine to be wed to Lord Trask of Traskin. The Duke, satisfied that these were persons whom he could address directly, asked if the terms of the marriage agreement had been reached. Both parties affirmed this. Sir Maximin passed a scroll to the Duke. Duke Angus began to read the stiff and precise legal phraseology. Marriages between noble houses were not matters to be left open and to dispute. A great deal of spilled blood and burned powder had resulted from ambiguity on some point of succession, or inheritance, or dower rights. Lucas bore it patiently. He didn't want his great-grandchildren and Elaine's shooting it out over a matter of a misplaced comma. "And these persons here before us do enter into this marriage freely?" the Duke asked, when the reading had ended. He stepped forward as he spoke, and his esquire gave him the 2-hand sword of state, heavy enough to behead a bisonoid. Trask stepped forward. Cesar Karvall brought Elaine up. The lawyers and henchmen obliqued off to the sides. "How say you, Lord Trask?" he asked, almost conversationally. "With all my heart, your grace." "And you, Lady Demoiselle Elaine?" "It is my dearest wish, your grace." The Duke took the sword by the blade and extended it. They laid their hands on the jeweled pommel. "And do you and your houses avow us, Angus, Duke of Wardshaven, to be your sovereign prince, and pledge fealty to us and to our legitimate and lawful successors?" "We do." Not only he and Elaine, but all around them and all the throng in the gardens answered, the spectators in shouts. Very clearly, above it all, somebody with more enthusiasm than discretion was bawling, "Long live Angus the First of Graham! And we, Angus, do confer upon you two, and your houses, the right to wear our badge as you see fit, and pledge ourselves to maintain your rights against any and all who may presume to invade them. And we declare that this marriage between you two and this agreement between your respective houses does please us, and we avow you two, Lucas and Elaine, to be lawfully wed. And whoso questions this marriage challenges us in our oath and to our despite." That wasn't exactly the wording used by a ducal lord on Graham. It was the formula employed by a planetary king, like Napoleon of Flamberge or Rodolph of Excalibur. And now that he thought of it, Angus had consistently used the royal first-person plural. Maybe that fellow who had shouted about Angus the First of Graham had only been doing what he'd been paid to do. This was being telecast, and Omfrey of Glaspythe and Richard of Didriksburg would both be listening. As of now, they'd start hiring mercenaries. Maybe that would get rid of Dunnan for him. The Duke gave the 2-hand sword back to his esquire. The young knight who was carrying the green and tawny shawl handed it to him, and Elaine dropped the black and yellow one from her shoulders, the only time a respectable woman ever did that in public, and her mother caught and folded it. He stepped forward and draped the Trask colors over her shoulders, and then took her in his arms. The cheering broke out again, and some of Cesar Karvall's guardsmen began firing a pom-pom somewhere. It took a little longer than he had expected to finish with the toasts and shake hands with those who crowded around. Finally, the exit march started, down the long walkway to the landing stage. and the Duke and his party moved away to the rear to prepare for the wedding feast at which everybody but the bride and groom would celebrate. One of the bridesmaids gave Elaine a huge sheaf of flowers, which she was to toss back from the escalator. She held it in the crook of one arm and clung to his with the other. "Darling, we really made it," she was whispering as though it were too wonderful to believe. Well, wasn't it one of the news cars, orange and blue, that was Wesla? Its telecast and teleprint had floated just ahead of them and was letting down toward the landing stage. For a moment he was angry that went beyond the outer orbit limits of journalistic propriety, even for Westland's T&T. Then he laughed. Today he was too happy for anger about anything. At the foot of the escalator, Elaine kicked off her gilded slippers. There was another pair in the car. He'd seen to that personally. And they stepped onto the escalator and turned about. The bridesmaids rushed forward and began struggling for the slippers, to the damage and disarray of their gowns, and when they were halfway up, Elaine heaved the bouquet and it burst apart among them like a bomb of colored fragrance, and the girls below snatched at the flowers, shrieking deliriously. Elaine stood, blowing kisses to everybody, and he was shaking his clasped hands over his head until they were at the top. When they turned and stepped off, the orange and blue aircar had let down directly in front of them, blocking their way. Now he was really furious and started forward with a curse. Then he saw who was in the car. Andray Dunnan, his thin face contorted and the narrow mustache writhing on his upper lip. He had a slit beside the window open and was tilting the barrel of a submachine gun up and out of it. He shouted and, at the same time, tripped Elaine and flung her down. He was throwing himself forward to cover her when there was a blasting multiple report. Something sledged him in the chest, his right leg crumpled under him. He fell and fell endlessly through darkness out of consciousness. He was crucified and crowned with a crown of thorns. Who had they done that to? Somebody long ago on Terra. His arms were drawn out stiffly and his feet and legs hurt too, and he couldn't move them, and there was this prickling at his brow. And he was blind. No, his eyes were just closed. He opened them, and there was a white wall in front of him, patterned with a blue snow crystal design, and he realized that it was a ceiling and that he was lying on his back. He couldn't move his head, but by shifting his eyes he saw that he was completely naked and surrounded by an angle of tubes and wires, which puzzled him briefly. Then he knew that he was not on a bed, but on a robometic, and the tubes would be for medication and wound drainage and intravenous feeding, and the wires would be to electrodes embedded in his body for diagnosis, and the crown of thorns thing would be more electrodes for an encephalograph. He'd been on one of those robometics before, when he had been gored by a bice. Onoid on the cattle range, that was what it was. He was still under treatment. But that seemed so long ago, so many things, he must have dreamed them, seemed to have happened. Then he remembered and struggled futilely to rise. "Elaine," he called. "Elaine, where are you?" There was a stir and somebody came into his limited view, his cousin Lucas Trask. "Lucas Andray Dunnan," he said. "What happened to Elaine?" Lucas winced as though something he had expected to hurt had hurt worse than he had expected. "Lucas," he swallowed. Elaine is dead. Elaine is dead. That didn't make sense. She was killed instantly, Lucas. Hit 6 times, I don't think she even felt the first one. She didn't suffer at all. Somebody moaned, and then he realized that it had been himself. "You were hit twice," Lucas was telling him. "One in the leg smashed the femur, and one in the chest. That one missed your heart by an inch. Pity it did." He was beginning to remember clearly now. "I threw her down and tried to cover her. I must have thrown her straight into the burst and only caught the last of it myself. There was something else, oh yes. Dunnan, did they get him?" Lucas shook his head. "He got away, stole the Enterprise and took her off-planet. I want to get him myself." He started to rise again. Lucas nodded to someone out of sight. A cool hand touched his chin and he smelled a woman's perfume, nothing at all like Elaine's. Something like a small insect bit him on the neck. The room grew dark. Elaine was dead. There was no more Elaine nowhere at all. Why, that must mean there was no more world. So that was why it had gotten so dark. He woke again fitfully, and it would be daylight, and he could see the yellow sky through an open window, or it would be night, and the wall lights would be on. There would always be somebody with him. Nicolay's wife, Dame Cecilia, Ravard Groffy's, Lady Elaine Karvall. He must have slept a long time, for she was so much older than he remembered, and her brother Bert Sandrassen, and a woman with dark hair in a white smock with a gold caduceus on her breast. Once Duchess Flavia, and once Duke Angus himself. He asked. Ere he was, not much caring. They told him at the ducal palace. He wished they'd all go away and let him go wherever Elaine was. Then it would be dark, and he would be trying to find her because there was something he wanted desperately to show her. Stars in the sky at night, that was it. But there were no stars, there was no Elaine, there was no anything, and he wished that there was no Lucas Trask either. But there was an Andray Dunnan. He could see him standing black-cloaked on the terrace, the diamonds in his beret jewel glittering evilly. He could see the mad face peering at him over the rising barrel of the submachine gun. And then he would hunt for him without finding him, through the cold darkness of space. The waking periods grew longer, and during them his mind was clear. They relieved him of his crown of electronic thorns. The feeding tubes came out, and they gave him cups of broth and fruit juice. He wanted to know why he had been brought to the palace. About the only thing we could do, Ravard Groffies told him. They had too much trouble at Karvall House as it was. You know, Cesar got shot, too? No. So that was why Cesar hadn't come to see him. Was he killed? Wounded? He's in worse shape than you are. When the shooting started, he went charging up the escalator. Didn't have anything but his dress dagger. Dunnan gave him a quick burst. I think that was why he didn't have time to finish you off. By that time, the guards who'd been shooting blanks from that rapid-fire gun got in a clip of live rounds and fired at him. He got out of there as fast as he could. They have Cesar on a robomedic like yours. He isn't in any danger. The drainage tubes and medication tubes came out, the tangle of wires. Around him was removed, and the electrodes with them. They bandaged his wounds and dressed him in a loose robe and lifted him from the robomedic to a couch, where he could sit up when he wished. They began giving him solid food and wine to drink, and allowed him to smoke. The woman doctor told him he'd had a bad time, as though he didn't know that. He wondered if she expected him to thank her for keeping him alive. You'll be up. And around in a few weeks, his cousin added. I've seen to it that everything at Trask and Newhouse will be ready for you by then. I'll never enter that house as long as I live, and I wish that wouldn't be more than the next minute. That was to be Elaine's house. I won't go to it alone. The dreams troubled his sleep less and less as he grew stronger. Visitors came often, bringing amusing little gifts, and he found that he enjoyed their come. He wanted to know what had really happened and how Dunnan had gotten away. He pirated the Enterprise, Ravard Groffies told him. He had that company of mercenaries of his, and he'd bribed some of the people at the Goram shipyards. I thought Alex would kill his chief of security when he found out what had happened. We can't prove anything, we're trying hard enough to, but we're sure Omfrey of Glasspithe furnished the money. He's in denying it just a shade too emphatically. Then the whole thing was planned in advance. Taking the ship was, he must have been planning that for months before he started recruiting that company. I think he meant to do it the night before the wedding. Then he tried to persuade the Lady Demoiselle Elaine to elope with him. He seems to have actually thought that was possible. And when she humiliated him, he decided to kill both of you first. He turned to Otto Harkaman, who had accompanied him. As long as I live, I'll regret not taking you at your word and accepting your offer then. How did he get hold of that Westland's telecast and teleprint car? Oh, the morning of the wedding, he screened Westland's editorial office and told them he had the inside story on the marriage and why the Duke was sponsoring it. Made it sound as though there was some scandal. Insisted that a reporter come to Dunnan House for a face-to-face interview. They sent a man, and that was the last they saw him alive. Our people found his body at Dunnan House when we were searching the place afterward. We found the car at the shipyard. It had taken a couple of hits from the guns at Karvall House, but you know what these press cars are built to stand. He went directly to the shipyard, where his men already had the Enterprise, as Sue. And as he arrived, she lifted out. He stared at the cigarette between his fingers. It was almost short enough to burn him. With an effort, he leaned forward to crush it out. Ravard, how soon will that second ship be finished? Groffies laughed bitterly. Building the Enterprise took everything we had. The duchy's on the edge of bankruptcy now. We stopped work on the second ship 6 months ago because we didn't have enough money to keep on with. Her and still get the Enterprise finished. We were expecting the Enterprise to make enough in the old Federation to finish the second one. Then with 2 ships and a base on Tanith, the money would begin coming in instead of going out. But now, it leaves me where I was on Flamberge, Harkaman added. Worse, King Napoleon was going to help the Elmersons, and I'd have gotten a command in that. It's too late for that now. He picked up his cane and used it to push himself to his feet. The broken leg had mended, but he was still weak. He took a few tottering steps, paused to lean on the cane, and then forced himself onto the open window and stood for a moment staring out. Then he turned. Captain Harkaman, it might be that you could still get a command, here on Graham. That's if you don't mind commanding under me as owner aboard. I am going hunting for Andray Dunnan. And they both looked at him. After a moment, Harkaman said, I'd count it an honor, Lord Trask, but where will you get a ship? She's half finished now. You already have a crew for her. Duke Angus can finish her for me and pay for it by pledging his new barony of Traskin. He had known Ravard Groffys all his life. Until this moment, he had never seen Duke Angus henchmen show surprise. You mean you'll trade Traskin for? At ship, he demanded. Finished, equipped, and ready for space, yes. The Duke will agree to that, Groffy said promptly. But Lucas, Traskin is all you own. If I have a ship, I won't need them. I am turning Space Viking. That brought Harkaman to his feet with a roar of approval. Groffys looked at him, his mouth slightly open. Lucas Trask, Space Viking, he said. Now I've heard everything. Well, why not? He had deplored the effects of Viking raiding on the sword worlds, because Graham was a sword world, and Traskin was on Graham. And Traskin was to have been the home where he and Elaine would live, and where their children and children's children would be born and live. Now the little point on which all of it had rested was gone. That was another Lucas Trask, Ravard. He's dead now. Groffys excused himself to make a screen call and then returned to excuse himself again. Evidently, Duke Angus had dropped whatever he was doing as soon as he heard what his henchmen had to tell him. Harkaman was silent until after he was out of the room, then said, Lord Trask, this is a wonderful thing for me. It's not been pleasant to be a shipless captain living on strangers' bounty. I'd hate, though, to have you think sometime that I'd advanced my own fortunes at the expense of yours. Don't worry about that. If anybody's being taken advantage of, you are. I need a space captain, and your misfortune is my own good luck. Harkaman started to pack tobacco into his pipe. Have you ever been off Graham at all? He asked. A few years at the University of Camelot on Excalibur. Otherwise, no. Well, have you any conception of the sort of thing you're setting yourself to? The Space Viking snapped his lighter and puffed. You know of course, how big the old Federation is. You know the figures, that is, but do they mean anything to you? I know they don't to a good many spacemen, even. We talk glibly about 10 to the 100th power, but emotionally we still count 1, 2, 3 many. A ship in hyperspace logs about a light year an hour. You can go from here to Excalibur in 30 hours. But you could send a radio message announcing the birth of a son. And he'd be a father before it was received. The old Federation, where you're going to hunt Dunnan, occupies a space volume of 200 billion cubic light-years, and you're hunting for one ship and one man in that. How are you going to do it, Lord Trask? I haven't started thinking about how. All I know is that I have to do it. There are planets in the old Federation where Space Vikings come and go, raid and trade basing. It's like the one Duke Angus planned to establish on Tanith. At one or another of them, I'll pick up word of Dunnan sooner or later. We'll hear where he was a year ago, and by the time we get there, he'll be gone for a year and a half to 2 years. We've been raiding the old Federation for over 300 years, Lord Trask. At present, I'd say there are at least 200 Space Viking ships in operation. Why haven't we raid? It bear long ago. Well, that's the answer. Distance and voyage time. You know, Dunnan could die of old age, which is not a usual cause of death among Space Vikings, before you caught up with him. And your youngest ship's boy could die of old age before he found out about it. Well, I can go on hunting for him till I die then. There's nothing else that means anything to me. I thought it was something like that. I won't be with you. All your life. I want a ship of my own like the Coruscant that I lost on Durandal. Someday I'll have one. But till you can command your own ship, I'll command her for you. That's a promise. Some note of ceremony seemed indicated, Summoning a robot, he had it pour wine for them, and they pledged each other. Ravard Groffes had recovered his aplomb by the time he returned accompanied by the Duke. If Angus had ever lost his, he gave no indication of it. The effect on everybody else was literally seismic. The generally accepted view was that Lord Trask's reason had been unhinged by his tragic loss. There might, he conceded, be more than a crumb of truth in that. At first, his cousin Nicolay raged at him for alienating the barony from the family, and then he learned that Duke Angus was appointing him vicar baron and giving him Trask and Newhouse for his residence. Immediately he began acting like one at the deathbed of a rich grandmother. The ward-shaven financial and industrial barons, whom he had known only distantly, on the other hand, came flocking around him, offering assistance and hailing him as the savior of the duchy. Duke Angus' credit, almost obliterated by the loss of the enterprise, was firmly re-established, and theirs with it. There were conferences at which lawyers and bankers argued interminably. He attended a few at first, found himself completely uninterested, and told everybody so. All he wanted was a ship, the best ship possible, as soon as possible. Alex Gorham had been the first to be notified. He had commenced work on the unfinished sister ship of the Enterprise immediately. Until he was strong enough to go to the shipyard himself, he watched the work on the 2,000-foot globular skeleton. And by screen, and conferred either in person or by screen with engineers and shipyard executives. His rooms at the Ducal Palace were converted, almost overnight, from sick rooms to offices. The doctors, who had recently been urging him to find new interests and activities, were now warning of the dangers of overexertion. Harkaman finally added his voice to theirs. "You take it easy, Lucas." They had dropped formality and were on a first-name basis now. "You got hulled pretty badly. You let damage control work on you and don't strain the machinery till it's fixed. We have plenty of time. We're not going to get anywhere chasing Dunnan. The only way we can catch him is by interception. The longer he moves around in the old Federation before he hears we're after him, the more of a trail he'll leave. Once we can establish a predictable pattern, we'll have a chance. Then sometime he'll come out of hyperspace somewhere and find us waiting for him. You think he went to Tanith?" Harkaman heaved himself out of his chair and prowled about the room for a few minutes, then came back and sat down again. "No, that was Duke Angus' idea, not his. He couldn't put in a base on Tanith anyhow. You know the kind of crew he has." There had been an extensive inquiry into Dunnan's associates and accomplices. Duke Angus was still hoping for positive proof to implicate Omfrey of Glasspithe in the piracy. Dunnan had with him 12.5 employees of the Gorham shipyards whom he had corrupted. There was some technical ability among them, but for the most part they were agitators and troublemakers and incompetent workmen. Even under the circumstances, Alex Gorham was glad to see the last of them. As for Dunnan's own mercenary company, there were about a score of former spacemen among them, the rest graded down from bandits through thugs and sneak thieves to barroom bums. Dunnan himself was an astrogator, not an engineer. "That gang aren't even good enough for routine raiding," Harkaman said. "They'd never under any circumstances be able to put in a base on Tanith. Unless Dunnan's completely crazy, which I doubt. He's gone to some regular Viking base planet, like Hoth or Nurgle or Dagon or Xochitl, to recruit officers and engineers and able spacemen. All that machinery and robotic equipment, and so on that was going to Tanith. Was that aboard when he took the ship? Yes, and that's another reason why he'd go to some planet like Hoth or Nurgle or Xochitl. On a Viking-occupied planet in the old Federation, that stuff's almost worth its weight in gold. What's Tanith like? Almost completely Terra-type, third of a Class G sun, very much like Haltekler or Flamberge. It was one of the last planets the Federation colonized before the Big War. Nobody knows what happened exactly. There wasn't any interstellar war. At least you don't find any big slag puddles where cities used to be. They probably did a lot of fighting among themselves after they got out of a Federation. There's still some traces of combat damage around. Then they started to decivilize down to the pre-mechanical level, wind and water power and animal power. They have draft animals that look like introduced Terran carabaos and a few small sailboats and big canoes and baytalks on the rivers. They have gunpowder, which seems to be the last thing any people lose. I was there 5 years ago. I like Tanith for a base. There. One moon, almost solid nickel iron and fissionable ore deposits. Then, like a fool, I hired out to the Elmersons on Durandal and lost my ship. When I came here, your Duke was thinking about Zipatotuk. I convinced him that Tanith was a better planet for his purpose. Dunnan might go there at that. He might think he was scoring one on Duke Angus. After all, he has all that equipment. And nobody to use it, if I... Dunnan, I'd go to Nurgle or Xochitl. There are always a couple of thousand Space Vikings on either, spending their loot and taking it easy between raids. He could sign on a full crew on either. I suggest we go to Xochitl first. We might pick up news of him, if nothing else. All right, they'd try Xochitl first. Harkaman knew the planet and was friendly with the Haltekler noble who ruled it. The work went on at the Gore. Shipyard. It had taken a year to build the Enterprise, but the steel mills and engine works were over the preparatory work of tooling up, and material and equipment was flowing in a steady stream. Lucas let them persuade him to take more rest, and day by day grew stronger. Soon he was spending most of his time at the shipyard, watching the engines go in. Abbott lift-hand drive for normal space, Dillingham hyperdrive, PA. Were converters, pseudograv, all at the center of the globular ship. Living quarters and workshops went in next, all armored in collapsium-plated steel. Then the ship lifted out to an orbit 1,000 miles off-planet, followed by swarms of armored workcraft and cargo lighters. The rest of the work was more easily done in space. At the same time, the 4 200-foot pinnaces that would be carried aboard were being finished. Each them had its own hyperdrive engines and could travel as far and as fast as the ship herself. Otto Harkaman was beginning to be distressed because the ship still lacked a name. He didn't like having to speak of her as her, or the ship, and there were many things soon to go on that should be name-marked. Elaine, Trask thought at once, and almost at once rejected it. He didn't want her name associated with the things that ship would do in. The old Federation. Revenge, Avenger, Retribution, Vendetta. None appealed to him. A news commentator, turgidly eloquent about the nemesis which the criminal Dunnan had invoked against himself, supplied it. Nemesis it was. Now he was studying his new profession of interstellar robbery and murder against which he had once inveighed. Otto Harkaman's handful of followers became his teachers. Van Larch, Guns and Missiles, who was awe. Also a painter, Gwat Kirby, sour and pessimistic, the hyperspatial astrogator who tried to express his science in music, Charles Renner, the normal space astrogator. Alvin Carford, the exec who had been with Harkaman longest of all, and Sir Patrick Morland, a local recruit, formerly guard captain to Count Lionel of New Haven, who commanded the ground fighters and the combat contragravity. They were using the farms and villages of Trascan for drill and practice, and he noticed that while the Nemesis would carry only 500 ground and air fighters, over 1,000 were being trained. He commented to Ravard Groffies. "Yes, don't mention it outside," the Duke's henchman said. "You and Sir Patrick and Captain Harkaman will pick the 500 best. The Duke will take the rest into his service. Some of these days, Omfrey of Glasspithe will find out what a Space Viking raid is really like. And Duke Angus would tax his new subjects of Glasspithe to redeem the pledges on his new barony of Trascan. Some old pre-atomic writer Harkaman was fond of quoting had said, 'Gold will not always get you good soldiers, but good soldiers can get you gold.'" The Nemesis came back to the Goram yards and settled onto her curved landing legs like a monstrous spider. The Enterprise had borne the ward's sword and atom symbol. The Nemesis should bear his own badge, but the bisonoid head, tawny on green of Trascan, was no longer his. He chose a skull impaled on an upright sword, and it was blazoned on the ship when he and Harkaman took her out for her shakedown cruise. When they landed again at the Goram yards, 200 hours later, they learned that a tramp freighter from Morglay had come into Bigelisp, ordered in their absence with news of Andray Dunnan. Her captain had come to Wardshaven at Duke Angus' urgent invitation and was waiting for them at the ducal palace. They sat, a dozen of them, around a table in the Duke's private apartments. The freighter captain, a small, precise man with a graying beard, alternately puffed at a cigarette and sipped from a beaker of brandy. "I spaced out from Morglay 200 hours ago," he was saying. "I'd been there 12 local days, 300 galactic standard hours, and the run from Cortana was 320. This ship, the Enterprise, spaced out from there several days before I did. I'd say she's 1,200 hours out of Windsor on Cortana now. The room was still. The breeze fluttered curtains at the open windows. From the garden below, winged night things twittered. "I never expected it," Harkaman said. Ought he'd take the ship out to the old Federation at once." He poured wine for himself. "Of course Dunnan's crazy. A crazy man has an advantage sometimes, like a left-handed knife fighter. He does unexpected things." "That wasn't such a crazy move," Robert Groffey said. "We have very little direct trade with Cortana. It's only an accident we heard about this when we did." The freighter captain's beaker was half empty. He filled it to the brim from the decanter. "She was the first Graham ship there for years," he agreed. "That attracted notice, of course, and his having the blazonry changed from the sword and atom symbol to the blue crescent, and the ill feeling on the part of other captains and planet-side employers about the men he'd lured away from them." "How many men and what kind?" The man with the gray beard shrugged. "I was too busy getting a cargo together for Morgul to pay much attention. Almost a full spaceship complement, officers and spacemen of every kind, and a lot of industrial engineers and technicians." "Then he is going to use that equipment that was aboard and put in a base somewhere," somebody said. "If he left Cortana 1,200 hours ago, he's still in hyperspace," Gwat Kirby said. "It's over 2,000 from Cortana to the nearest old Federation planet." "How far to Tanith?" Duke Angus asked. "I'm sure that's where he's gone. He'd expect me to finish the other ship and equip her like the Enterprise and send her out. He'd want to get there first." "I thought that Tanith would be the last place he'd go," Harkaman said, "but this changes the whole outlook. He could have gone to Tanith." "He's crazy and you're trying to apply sane logic to him," Gwat Kirby said. "You're figuring what you do and you aren't crazy. Of course, I've had my doubts at times, but yes, he's crazy and Captain Harkaman's allowing for that," Ravard Groffey said. "Dunnan hates all of us. He hates His Grace here. He hates Lord Lucas and Cesar Karvall. Of course, he may think he killed both of them. He hates Captain Harkaman. So how could he score all of us off at once? By taking Tanith. You say he was buying supplies and ammunition? That's right. Gun ammunition, ship's missiles, and a lot of ground defense missiles." "What was he buying them with? Trading machinery?" "No, gold." "Yes, Lothar F. Fail found out that a lot of gold was transferred to Dunnan from banks in Glasspithe and Didriksburg," Groffey said. "He got that aboard when he took the ship, evidently." "All right," Trask said. "We can't be sure of anything, but we have some reasons for thinking. He went to Tanith, and that's more than we have for any other planet in the old Federation. I won't try to estimate the odds against our finding him there, but they're a good deal bigger anywhere else. We'll go there first." The outside view screen, which had been vacantly gray for over 3,000 hours, was now a vertiginous swirl of color, the indescribable color of a collapsing hyperspatial field. No two observers ever saw alike, and no imagination could vision the actuality. Trask found that he was holding his breath. So, he noticed, was Otto Harkaman beside him. It was something, evidently, that nobody got used to. Even Gwat Kirby, the astrogator, was sitting with his pipe clenched in his mouth, staring at the screen. Then, in an instant, the stars, which had literally not been there before, filled the screen with a blaze of splendor again. It's the black velvet backdrop of normal space. Dead in the center, brighter than all the rest, Urtado's star, the son of Tanith, burned yellowly. The light from it was 10 hours old. "Pretty good, Gwat," Harkaman said, picking up his cup. "Good, Gehenna, it was perfect," somebody else said. Kirby was relighting his pipe. "Oh, I suppose it'll have to do," he grudged around the stem. He had gray hair and an untidy mustache, and nothing was ever quite good enough to satisfy him. "I could have made it a little closer. Need 3 microjumps now, and I'll have to cut the last one pretty fine. Now don't bother me." He began punching buttons for data and fiddling with set screws and verniers. For a moment in the screen, Trask could see the face of Andray Dunnan. He blinked it away and reached for his cigarettes, and put one in his mouth wrong end to. When he reversed it and snapped his lighter, he saw that his hand was trembling. Otto Harkaman must have seen that, too. "Take it easy, Lucas," he whispered. "Keep your optimism under control. We only think he might be here." "I'm sure he is. He has to be." No, that was the way Dunnan himself thought. "Let's be sane about this. We have to assume he is. If we do and he isn't, it's a disappointment. If we don't and he is, it's a disaster." Others, thought the same way. The battle stations board was a solid blaze of red light for full combat readiness. "All right," Kirby said, jumping. Then he twisted the red handle to the right and shoved it in viciously. Again the screen boiled with colored turbulence. Again dark and mighty forces stalked through the ship like demons in a sorcerer's tower. The screen turned featureless gray as the pickup stared blindly into some dimensionless place. Then it convulsed with color again, and this time Hurtado's star, still in the center, was a coin-sized disk, with the little sparks of its 7 planets scattered around it. Tanith was the third, the inhabitable planet of a G-class system usually was. It had a single moon barely visible in the telescopic screen, 500 miles in diameter and 50,000 off-planet. "You know," Kirby said, as though he was afraid to admit it, "that wasn't too bad. I think we can make it in one more micro-jump." Sometime, Trask supposed, he'd be able to use the expression micro about a distance of 55 million miles, too. "What do you think about it?" Harkaman asked him, as deferentially as though seeking expert guidance instead of examining his apprentice. "Where should Gwat put us?" "As close as possible, of course. That would be a light second at the least. If the Nemesis came out of hyperspace any closer to anything the size of Tanith, the collapsing field itself would kick her back. We have to assume Dunnan's been there at least 900 hours. By that time, he could have put in a detection station and maybe missile launchers on the moon. The Enterprise carries 4 pinnaces, the same as the Nemesis. In his place, I'd have at least 2 of them on off-planet patrol. So let's accept that we'll be detected as soon as we come out of the last jump, and come out with the moon directly between us and the planet. If it's occupied, we can knock it off on the way in." "A lot of captains would try to come out with the moon masked off by the planet," Harkaman said. "Would you?" The big man shook his tousled head. "No, if they have launchers on the moon, they could launch at us in a curve around the planet, by data relayed from the other side, and we'd be at a disadvantage replying. Just go straight in. You hearing this, Gwat?" "Yeah, it makes sense, sort of. Now stop pestering me. Charlo, look here a minute." The normal space astrogator conferred with him. Alvin Carford, the executive officer, joined them. Finally, Kirby pulled out the big red handle, twisted it, and said, "All right, jumping." He shoved it in. "I suppose I cut it too fine now. We'll get kicked back 500,000 miles. The screen convulsed again. When it cleared, the third planet was directly in the center. Its small moon, looking almost as large, was a little above and to the right, sunlit on one side and planetlit on the other. Kirby locked the red handle, gathered up his tobacco and lighter and things from the ledge, and pulled down the cover of the instrument console, locking it. "All yours, Charlo," he told Renner. 8 hours to atmosphere, Renner said. "That's if we don't have to waste a lot of time shooting up Junior there." Van Larch was looking at the moon in the 600-power screen. "I don't see anything to shoot. 500 miles, 1 planet buster, or 4 or 5 thermonuclears," he said. It wasn't right, Trask thought indignantly. Minutes ago, Tanith had been 6.5 billion miles away. Seconds ago, 50-odd million. And now, 250,000, and looking close enough to touch in the screen, it would take them 8 hours to reach it. Why, on hyperdrive you could go 48 trillion miles in that time. Well, it took a man just as long to walk across a room today as it had taken Pharaoh the First or Homo sap. In the telescopic screen, Tanith looked like any picture of any Terra-type planet from space, with cloud-blurred contours of seas and continents, and a vague modeling of gray and brown and green, topped at the pole by an ice cap. None of the surface features, not even the major mountain ranges or rivers, were yet distinguishable. But Harkaman and Charlo Renner and Alvin Carford and the other old hands seemed to recognize it. Carford was talking by phone to Paul Koreff, the signals and detection officer, who could detect nothing from the moon and nothing that was getting through the Van Allen belt from the planet. Maybe they'd guessed wrong at that. Maybe Dunnan hadn't gone to Tanith at all. Harkaman, who had the knack of putting himself to sleep at will with some 6th or nth sense posted as a sentry, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Trask wished he could, too. It would be hours before anything happened, and until then he needed all the rest he could get. He drank more coffee, chain. Smoked cigarettes. He rose and prowled about the command room, looking at screens. Signals and detection was getting a lot of routine stuff, Van Allen count, micrometeor count, surface temperature, gravitation field strength, radar and scanner echoes. He went back to his chair and sat down, staring at the screen image. The planet didn't seem to be getting any closer at all, and it ought to. They were approaching it at better than escape velocity. He sat and stared at it. He woke with a start. The screen image was much larger now. River courses and the shadow lines of mountains were clearly visible. It must be early autumn in the northern hemisphere. There was snow down to the 60th parallel, and a belt of brown was pushing south against the green. Harkaman was sitting up, eating lunch. By the clock, it was 4 hours later. "Have a good nap?" he asked. "We're picking up some stuff now. Radio and screen signals. Not much, but some. The locals wouldn't have learned enough for that in the 5 years since I was here. We didn't stay long enough, for one thing. On decivilized planets that were visited by Space Vikings, the locals picked up bits and scraps of technology very quickly. In the 4 months of idleness and long conversations, while they were in hyperspace, he had heard many stories confirming that, but from the level to which Tanith had sunk, radio and screen communication in 5 years was a little too much of a jump. "You didn't lose any men, did you?" That happened frequently. Men who took up with local women, men who had made themselves unpopular with their shipmates, men who just liked the planet and wanted to stay. They were always welcomed by the locals for what they could do and teach. "No, we weren't there." "Long enough for that, only 350 hours. This we're getting is outside stuff, somebody's there beside the locals." Dunnan. He looked again at the battle stations board. It was still uniformly red-lighted. Everything was on full combat ready. He summoned a mess robot, selected a couple of dishes, and began to eat. After the first mouthful, he called to Alvin Carford. "Is Paul getting anything new?" he asked. Carford checked. "Little contragravity field distortion effect." It was still too far to be sure. He went back to his lunch. He had finished it and was lighting a cigarette over his coffee when a red light flashed and a voice from one of the speakers shouted, "Detection. Detection from planet, radar and microray." Carford began talking rapidly into a hand phone. Harkaman unhooked one beside him and listened. "Coming from a definite point, about 25th north parallel," he said aside. "Could be from a ship hiding against the planet. There's nothing at all on the moon. They seem to be approaching the planet more and more rapidly." Actually, they weren't. The ship was decelerating to get into an orbit, but the decreasing distance created the illusion of increasing speed. The red lights flashed once more. "Ship detected, just outside atmosphere, coming around the planet from the west." "Is the Enterprise?" "Can't tell yet," Carford said, and then cried. "There she is in the screen, that spark, about 30 degrees north, just off the west side." Aboard her, too, voices from speakers would be shouting, "Ship detected," and the battle station board would be blazing red. "And Andray Dunnan at the command desk. She's calling us." That was Paul Koreff's voice, out of the squawk box on the desk. Standard Sword World impulse code. Interrogative, what ship are you? Informative, her screen combination. Request, please communicate. "All right," Harkaman said. "Let's be polite and communicate." "What's her screen combination?" Koreff's voice gave it, and Harkaman punched it out. The communication screen in front of them lit at once. Trask shoved over his chair beside Harkaman's, his hands tightening on the arms. Would it be Dunnan himself, and what would his ace show when he saw who confronted him out of his own screen? It took him an instant to realize that the other ship was not the Enterprise at all. The Enterprise was the Nemesis twin. Her command room was identical with his own. This one was different in arrangements and fittings. The Enterprise was a new ship. This one was old, and had suffered for years at the hands of a slack captain and a slovenly crew, and the man who sat facing him. The screen was not Andray Dunnan, or any man he had ever seen before. A dark-faced man with an old scar that ran down one cheek from a little below the eye. He had curly black hair on his head, and on a V of chest exposed by an open shirt. There was an ashtray in front of him, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a cigar in it, and coffee steamed in an ornate but battered silver cup beside it. He was grinning gleefully. "Well, Captain Harkaman of the Enterprise, I believe. Welcome to Tanith. Who's the gentleman with you? He isn't the Duke of Wardshaven, is he?" He glanced quickly at the showback over the screen to assure himself that his face was not betraying him. Beside him, Otto Harkaman was laughing. "Why, Captain Valkenhayn, this is an unexpected pleasure. That's the space scourge you're in, I take it. What are you doing here on Tanith?" a voice from one of the speakers shouted that a second ship had been detected coming over the North Pole. The dark-faced man in the screen smirked quite complacently. "That's Garvan Spaso in the Lamia," he said. "And what we're doing here, we've taken this planet over. We intend keeping it, too." "Well, so you and Garvan have teamed up. You two were just made for one another, and you have a little planet all your very own. I'm so happy for both of you. What are you getting out of it beside poultry?" The other's self-assurance started to slip. He slapped it back into place. "Don't kid me, we know why you're here. Well, we got here first. Tanith is our planet. You think you can take it away from us?" "I know we could, and so do you," Harkaman told him. "We outgun you and Spaso together. Why, a couple of our pinnaces could knock the Lamia apart. The only question is, do we want to bother?" By now, he had recovered from his surprise, but not from his disappointment. If this fellow thought the nemesis was the Enterprise, before he could check himself, he had finished the thought aloud. "Then the Enterprise didn't come here at all," the man in the screen started. "Isn't that the Enterprise you're in?" "Oh no, pardon my remissness, Captain Valkenhayn," Harkaman apologized. "This is the nemesis, the gentleman with Lord Lucas Trask is owner aboard for whom I am commanding. Lord Trask, Captain Boak Valkenhayn of the Space Scourge. Captain Valkenhayn is a Space Viking." He said that as though expecting it to be disputed. "So, I am told, is his associate, Captain Spaso, whose ship is approaching. You mean to tell me that the Enterprise hasn't been here?" Valkenhayn was puzzled, slightly apprehensive. "You mean the Duke of Wardshaven has 2 ships? As far as I know, the Duke of Wardshaven hasn't any ships," Harkaman replied. "This ship is the property and private adventure of Lord Trask. The Enterprise, for which we are looking, is owned and commanded by one Andray Dunnan." The man with the scarred face and hairy chest had picked up his cigar and was puffing on it mechanically. Now he took it out of his mouth as though he wondered how it had gotten there in the first place. "But isn't the Duke of Wardshaven sending a ship here to establish a base? That was what we'd heard. We heard you'd gone from Flamberge to Graham to command for him." "Where did you hear this? And when?" "On Hoth. That'd be about 2,000 hours ago. A Gilgameshire brought the news from Xochitl." "Well, considering it was 5th or 6th hand, your information was good enough when it was fresh. It was a year and a half old when you got it. Though, how long have you been here on Tanith?" "About 1,000 hours." Harkaman clucked sadly at that. "Pity you wasted all that time. Well, it was nice talking to you, Boak. Say hello to Garvan for me when he comes up." "You mean you're not staying?" Valkenhayn was horrified, an odd reaction for a man who had just been expecting a bitter battle to drive them away. "You're just spacing right out again?" Harkaman shrugged. "Do we want to waste time here, Lord Trask? The Enterprise has obviously gone somewhere else. She was still in hyperspace when Captain Valkenhayn and his accomplice arrived here. Is there anything worth staying for?" That seemed to be the reply Harkaman was expecting. "Beside poultry, that is." Harkaman shook his head. "This is Captain Valkenhayn's planet, his and Captain Spaso's. Let them be stuck with it." "But look, this is a good planet. There's a big local city, maybe 10 or 20,000 people, temples and palaces and everything. Then there are a couple of old Federation cities. The one we're at is in good shape, and there's a big spaceport. We've been doing a lot of work on it, and the locals won't give you any trouble. All they have is spears and a few crossbows and matchlocks." "I know, I've been here." "Well, couldn't we make some kind of a deal?" Valkenhayn asked. A mendicant whine was beginning to creep into his voice. "I can get Garvan on screen and switch him over to your ship." "Well, we have a lot of Sword World merchandise aboard," Harkaman said. "We could make you good prices on some of it. How are you fixed for robotic equipment?" "But aren't you going to stay here?" Valkenhayn was almost in a panic. "Listen, suppose I talk to Garvan and we all get together on this." "Just excuse me for a minute." As soon as he had blanked out, Harkaman threw back his head and guffawed as though he had just heard the funniest and bawdiest joke in the galaxy. Trask, himself, didn't feel like laughing. "The humor escapes me," he admitted. "We came here on a fool's errand." "I'm sorry, Lucas." Harkaman was still shaking with mirth. "I know it's a letdown, but that pair of chiseling chicken thieves, I could almost pity them if it weren't so funny." He laughed again. You know what their idea was? Trask shook his head. Who are they? What I called them, a couple of chicken thieves. They raid planets like Set and Hertha and Melkarth where the locals haven't anything to fight with or anything worth fighting for. I didn't know they'd teamed up, but that figures. Nobody else would team up with either of them. What must have happened, this story of Duke Angus? Tanith Adventure must have filtered out to them, and they thought that if they got here first, I'd think it was cheaper to take them in than run them out. I probably would have, too. They do have ships of a sort, and they do raid after a fashion. But now there isn't going to be any Tanith base, and they have a no-good planet, and they're stuck with it. Can't they make anything out of it themselves? Like what? Harkaman hooted. They have no equipment. And they have no men. Not for a job like that. The only thing they can do is space out and forget it. We could sell them equipment. We could if they had anything to use for money. They haven't. One thing we do want to let down and give the men a chance to walk on ground and look at a sky for a while. The girls here aren't too bad either, Harkaman said. As I remember, some of them even take a bath now and then. That's the kind of news of Dunnan we're going to get. By the time we'd get to where he's been reported, he'd be a couple of thousand light-years away, he said disgustedly. I agree. We ought to give the men a chance to get off the ship here. We can stall this pair along for a while and we won't have any trouble with them. The three ships were slowly converging toward a point 15,000 miles off-planet and over the sunset line. The space scurred. Bore the device of a mailed fist clutching a comet by the head. It looked more like a whisk broom than a scourge. The Lamia bore a coiled snake with the head, arms, and bust of a woman. Valkenhayn and Spasso were taking their time about screening back, and he began to wonder if they weren't maneuvering the Nemesis into a crossfire position. He mentioned this to Harkaman and Alvin Carford. They both laughed. Just holding ships meetings, Carford said. They'll be yakking back and forth for a couple of hours yet. Yes, Valkenhayn and Spasso don't own their ships, Harkaman explained. They've gone in debt to their crews for supplies and maintenance till everybody owns everything in common. The ships look like it, too. They don't even command, really. They just preside over elected command councils. Finally, they had both of the more or less commanders on screen. Valkenhayn had zipped up his shirt and put on a jacket. Garvan Spasso was a small man, partly bald. His eyes were a shade too close together, and his thin mouth had a bitterly crafty twist. He began speaking at once. Captain, Boak tells me you say you're not here in the service of the Duke of Wardshaven at all. He said it aggrievedly. That's correct, Harkaman said. We came here because Lord Trask thought another Graham ship, the Enterprise, would be here. Since she isn't, there's no point in our being here. We do hope, though, that you won't make any difficulty about our letting down and giving our men a couple of 100 hours liberty. They've been in hyperspace for 3,000 hours. See, Spasso clamored. He wants to trick us into letting him land, Captain Spasso, Trask cut in. Will you please stop insulting everybody's intelligence, your own included? Spasso aired at him, belligerently but hopefully. I understand what you thought you were going to do here. You expected Captain Harkaman here to establish a base for the Duke of Wardshaven, and you thought, if you were here ahead of him and in a posture of defense, that he'd take you into the Duke's service rather than waste ammunition and risk damage and casualties wiping you out. Well, I'm very sorry, gentlemen. Captain Harkaman is in my service, and I'm not in the least interested in establishing a base on Tanith. Valkenhayn and Spasso looked at each other. At least in the two side-by-side screens, their eyes shifted, each to the other's screen on his own ship. I get it, Spasso cried suddenly. There's two ships, the Enterprise and this one. The Duke of Wardshaven fitted out the Enterprise and somebody else fitted out this one. They both want to put in a base here. And a glorious vista. Instead of merely capitalizing on their nuisance value, they might find themselves holding the balance of power in a struggle for the planet. All sorts of profitable perfidies were possible. Why, sure you can land, Otto, Valkenhayn said. I know what it's like to be 3,000 hours in hyper myself. You're at this old city with the two tall tower buildings, aren't you? Harkaman asked. He looked up at the views. Reen, ought to be about midnight there now. How's the spaceport? When I was here it was pretty bad. Oh, we've been fixing it up. We got a big gang of locals working for us. Rivington Spaceport, the city was familiar, from Otto Harkaman's descriptions, and from the pictures Van Larch had painted during the long jump from Graham. As they came in, it looked impressive, spreading for miles around the twin buildings that spired almost 3 1,000 feet above it, with a great spaceport like an 8-pointed star at one side. Whoever had built it, in the sunset splendor of the old Terran Federation, must have done so confident that it would become the metropolis of a populous and prospering world. Then the sun of the Federation had gone down. Nobody knew what had happened on Tanith after that, but evidently none of it had been good. At first, the two towers seemed as sound as when they had been built. Gradually, it became apparent that one was broken at the top. For the most part, the smaller buildings scattered widely around them were standing, though here and there mounds of brush-grown rubble showed where some had fallen in. The spaceport looked good, a central octagon mass of buildings, the landing berths, and beyond, the triangular areas of airship docks and warehouses. The central building was outwardly intact, and the ship berths seemed clear of wreckage and rubble. By the time the Nemesis was following the Space Scourge and the Lamia down, towed by her own pinnaces, the illusion that they were approaching a living city had vanished. The interspaces between the buildings were choked with forest growth, broken by a few small fields and garden plots. At one time, there had been 3 of the high buildings, literally vertical cities in themselves. Where the third had stood was a glazed crater with a ridge of fallen rubble lying away from it. Somebody must have landed a medium missile, about 20 kilotons, against its base. Something of the same sort had scored on the far edge of the spaceport, and one of the 8 arrowheads of docks and warehouses was an indistinguishable slag pile. The rest of the city seemed to have died of neglect rather than violence. It certainly hadn't been bombed out. Harkaman thought. Most of the fighting had been done with subneutron bombs or omega-ray bombs that killed the people without damaging the real estate. Or bioweapons, a man-made plague that had gotten out of control and all but depopulated the planet. It takes an awful lot of people, working together at an awful lot of jobs, to keep a civilization running. Smash the installations and kill the top technicians and scientists, and the masses don't know how to rebuild and go back to stone hatchets. Kill off enough of the masses, and even if the planet and the know-how is left, there's nobody to do the work. I've seen planets that decivilized both ways. Tanith, I think, is one of the latter. That had been during one of the long after-dinner bull sessions on the way out from Graham. Somebody, one of the noble gentleman adventurers who had joined the company after the piracy of the Enterprise, and the murder had asked, but some of them survived. Don't they know what happened? In the old times, there were sorcerers. They built the old buildings by wizard arts. Then the sorcerers fought among themselves and went away, Harkaman said. That's all they know about it. You could make any kind of an explanation out of that. As the pinnaces pulled and nudged the Nemesis down to her berth, he could see people far down on the spaceport floor. Work. Either Valkenhayn and Spaso had more men than the size of their ships indicated, or they had gotten a lot of locals to work for them. More than the population of the moribund city, at least as Harkaman remembered it. There had been about 500 in all. They lived by mining the old buildings for metal, and trading metalwork for food and textiles and powder and other things made elsewhere. It was accessible only by oxcarts traveling 100 miles across the plains. It had been built by a contragravity-using people with utter disregard for natural travel and transportation routes. I don't envy the poor buggers, Harkaman said, looking down at the ant-like figures on the spaceport floor. Both Valkenhayn and Garvan Spaso have probably made slaves of the lot of them. If I was really going to put in a base here, I wouldn't thank that. Air for the kind of public relations work they've been doing among the locals. That was just about the situation. Spaso and Valkenhayn and some of their officers met them on the landing stage of the big building in the middle of the spaceport, where they had established quarters. Entering and going down a long hallway, they passed a dozen men and women gathering up rubbish from the floor with shovels and with their hands and putting it into a lifter skid. Both sexes wore shapeless garments of coarse cloth, like ponchos and flat-soled sandals. Watching them was another local in a kilt, buskins, and a leather jerkin. He wore a short sword on his belt and carried a wickedly thonged whip. He also wore a Space Viking combat helmet, painted with the device of Spaso's Lamia. He bowed as they approached, putting a hand to his forehead. After they had passed, they could hear him shouting at the others and the sound of whip blows, You make slaves out of people, and some will always be slave drivers. They will bow to you and then take it out on the others. Harkamen's nose was twitching as though he had a bit of rotten fish caught in his mustache. We have about 800 of them. There were only 300 that were any good for work here. We gathered the rest up at villages along the big river, Spaso was saying. How do you get food for them? Harkamen asked. Or don't you bother? Oh, we gather that up all over, Valkenhayn told him. We send parties out with landing craft. They'll let down on a village, run the locals out, gather up what's around and bring it here. Once in a while they put up a fight, but the best they have is a few crossbows and some muzzle-loading muskets. When they do, we burn the village and machine gun everybody we see. It's the stuff, Harkamen approved. If the cow doesn't want to be milked, just shoot her. Of course, you don't get much milk out of her again, but... The room to which their hosts guided them was at the far end of the hall. It had probably been a conference room or something of the sort, and originally it had been paneled, but the paneling had long ago vanished. Holes had been dug here and there in the walls, and he remembered having noticed that the door was gone and the metal groove in which it had slid had been pried out. There was a big table in the middle, and chairs and couches covered with colored spreads. All the furniture was handmade, cunningly pegged together, and highly polished. On the walls hung trophies of weapons, thrusting spears and throwing spears, crossbows and quarrels, and a number of heavy guns, crude things, but carefully made. Pick all this stuff up off the locals? Harkamen asked. Yes, we got most of it at a big town down at the forks of the river, Valkenhayn said. We shook it down a couple of times. That's where we recruited the fellows we're using to boss the workers. Then he picked up a stick with a leather-covered knob and beat on a gong, bawling for wine. A voice somewhere replied, Yes, master, I come. And in a few moments a woman entered carrying a jug in either hand. She was wearing a blue bathrobe, several sizes too large for her, instead of the poncho things the slaves in the hallway wore. She had dark brown hair and gray eyes. If she had not been so obviously frightened, she would have been beautiful. She set the jugs on the table and brought silver cups from a chest against the wall. When Spaso dismissed her, she went out hastily. I suppose it's silly to ask if you're paying these people anything for the work they do or for the things you take. From them, Harkamen said. From the way the Space Scourge and Lamia people laughed, it evidently was. Harkamen shrugged. Well, it's your planet. Make any kind of a mess out of it you want to. You think we ought to pay them? Spaso was incredulous. Damn bunch of savages. They aren't as savage as the Xochitl locals were when Haltekler took it over. You've been there, you've seen what Prince Victor does with them now. We haven't got them. Inner equipment they have on Xochitl, Valkenhayn said. We can't afford to coddle the locals. You can't afford not to, Harkamen told him. You have 2 ships here. You can only use one for raiding. The other will have to stay here to hold the planet. If you take them both away, the locals, whom you have been studiously antagonizing, will swamp whoever you leave behind. And if you don't leave anybody behind, what's a use of having a planetary base? Well, why don't you join us? Spaso finally came out with it. With our 3 ships, we could have a real thing here. Harkamen looked at him inquiringly. The gentlemen, Trask said, are putting this wrongly. They mean, why don't we let them join us? Well, if you want to put it like that, Valkenhayn conceded. We'll admit your nemesis would be the big end of it, but why not 3 ship? So we could have a real base here. Nicky Gratham's father only had 2 when he started on Jagannath, and look what the Grathams got there now. Are we interested? Harkamen asked. Not very, I'm afraid. Of course, we've just landed. Tanith may have great possibilities. Suppose we reserve decision for a while and look around a little. There were stars in the sky and, for good measure, a sliver of moon on the western horizon. It was only a small moon, but it was close. He walked to the edge of the landing stage, and Elaine was walking with him. The noise from inside, where the Nemesis crew were feasting with those of the Lamia and Space Scourge, grew fainter. To the south, a star moved, one of the pinnaces they had left on off-planet watch. There was firelight far below, and he could hear singing. Suddenly he realized that it was the poor devils of locals whom Valkenhayn and Spaso had enslaved. Elaine went away quickly. Have your fill of Space Viking glamour, Lucas? He turned. It was Baron Rathmore, who had come along to serve for a year or so and then hitch a ride home from some base planet and cash in politically on having been with Lucas Trask. For the moment, I'm told that this lot aren't typical. I hope not. They're a pack of sadistic brutes and piggish along with it. Well, brutality and bad manners I can condone, but Spaso and Valkenhayn are a pair of ignominious little crooks and stupid along with it. If Andray Dunnan had gotten here ahead of us, he might have done one good thing in his wretched life. I can't understand why he didn't come here. I think he still will, Rathmore said. I knew him and I knew Neville Orme. Orme's ambitious and Dunnan is insanely vindictive. He broke off with a sour laugh. I'm telling you that? Didn't he come here directly then? Maybe he doesn't want a base on Tanith. That would be something constructive. Dunnan's a destroyer. I think he took that cargo of equipment somewhere and sold it. I think he'll wait till he's fairly sure the other ship is finished. Then he'll come in and shoot the place up the way. He bit that off abruptly. The way he did my wedding, I think of it all the time. The next morning, he and Harkaman took an air car and went to look at the city at the forks of the river. It was completely new, in the sense that it had been built since the collapse of Federation civilization and the loss of civilized technologies. It was huddled on a long, irregularly triangular mound, evidently to raise it above flood level. Generations of labor must have gone into it. To the eyes of a civilization using contragravity and powered equipment, it wasn't at all impressive. 50 to 100 men with adequate equipment could have gotten the thing up in a summer. It was only by forcing himself to think in terms of spadeful after spadeful of earth, cartload after cartload creaking behind straining beasts, timber after timber cut with axes and dressed with adzes, stone after stone and brick after brick, that he could appreciate it. They even had it walled, with a palisade of tree trunks behind it. Earth and rocks had been banked, and along the river were docks at which boats were moored. The locals simply called it Trade Town. As they approached, a big gong began booming, and a white puff of smoke was followed by the thud of a signal gun. The boats, long canoe-like craft and round-bowed, many-oared barges, put out hastily into the river. Through binoculars they could see people scattering from the surrounding fields, driving cattle ahead of them. By the time they were over the city, nobody was in sight. They seemed to have developed a pretty fair air raid warning system in the 900-odd hours in which they had been exposed to the figurative mercies of Boke Valkenhayn and Garvan Spaso. It hadn't saved them entirely. A section of the city had been burned, and there were evidences of shelling. Light chemical explosive stuff. This city was too good a cow for even those two to kick. Before the milking was over, they circled slowly over it at 1,000 feet. When they turned away, black smoke began rising from what might have been pottery works or brick kilns on the outskirts. Something resinous had evidently been fed to the fires. Other columns of black smoke began rising across the countryside on both sides of the river. You know, these people are civilized, if you don't limit the term to contragravity and energy, Harkaman said. They have gunpowder, for one thing, and I can think of some rather impressive old Terran civilizations that didn't have that much. They have an organized society, and anybody who has that is starting toward civilization. I hate to think of what'll happen to this planet if Spaso and Valkenhayn stay here long. Might be a good thing in the long run. Good things in the long run are often tough while they're happening. I know what'll happen to Spaso and Valkenhayn, though. They'll start decivilizing themselves. They'll stay here for a while, and when they need something they can't take from the locals, they'll go chicken stealing after it. But most of the time they'll stay here lording it over their slaves, and finally their ships will wear out and they won't be able to fix them. Then, sometime, the locals will jump them when they aren't watching and wipe them out. But in the meantime, the locals will learn a lot from them. They turned the aircar west again along the river. They looked at a few villages. One or two dated from the Federation period. They had been plantations before whatever it was had happened. More had been built within the past 5 centuries. A couple had recently been destroyed, in punishment for the crime of self-defense. You know, he said at length, I'm going to do everybody a favor. I'm going to let Spaso and Valkenhayn persuade me to take this planet away from them. Harkaman, who was piloting, turned sharply. You crazy or something? When somebody makes a statement you don't understand, don't tell him he's crazy. Ask him what he means. Who said that? On target. Harkaman grinned. What do you mean, Lord Trask? I can't catch Dunnan by pursuit. I'll have to get him by interception. You know. A source of that quotation, too. This looks to me like a good place to intercept him. When he learns I have a base here, he'll hit it sooner or later. And even if he doesn't, we can pick up more information on him when ships start coming in here than we would batting around all over the old Federation. Harkaman considered for a moment, then nodded. Yes, if we could set up a base like Nurgle or Xochitl, he agreed. There'll be 4 or 5 ships, Space Vikings, traders, Gilgameshers, and so on either of those planets all the time. If we had the cargo Dunnan took to space in the Enterprise, we could start a base like that. But we haven't anything near what we need, and you know what Spaso and Valkenhayn have. We can get it from Graham. As it stands, the investors in the Tanith adventure from Duke Angus down lost everything they put into it. If they're willing to throw some good money after bad, they can get it back and a handsome profit to boot. And there ought to be planets above the rowboat and oxcart level not too far away that could be raided for a lot of things we'd need. That's right. I know of half a dozen within 500 light years. They won't be the kind Spaso and Valkenhayn are in the habit of raiding, though. And besides machinery, we can get gold and valuable merchandise that could be sold on Graham. And if we could make a go of it, you'd go farther hunting Dunnan by sitting here on Tanith than by going looking for him. That was the way we used to hunt marsh pigs on Kalata when I was a kid. Just find a good place and sit down and wait. They had Valkenhayn and Spaso aboard the Nemesis for dinner. It didn't take much guiding to keep the conversation on the subject of Tan. And its resources, advantages, and possibilities. Finally, when they had reached brandy and coffee, Trask said idly, I believe together we could really make something out of this planet. That's what we've been telling you all along, Spaso broke in eagerly. This is a wonderful planet, it could be. All it has now is possibilities. We'd need a spaceport, for one thing. Well, what's this here? Valkenhayn wanted to know. It was a space port, Harkaman told him. It could be one again. And we'd need a shipyard, capable of any kind of heavy repair work. Capable of building a complete ship, in fact. I never saw a ship come into a Viking base planet with any kind of a cargo worth dickering over that hadn't taken some damage getting it. Prince Victor of Xochitl makes a good half of his money on ship repairs, and so do Nicky Gratham on Jagannath and the Everards on Hoth. And engine works, hyperdrive, normal space, and pseudograv, Trask added. And a steel mill and a collapsed matter plant, and robotic equipment works, and— Oh, that's out of all reason, Valkenhayn cried. It would take 20 trips with a ship the size of this one to get all that stuff here, and how'd we ever be able to pay for it? That's the sort of base Duke Angus of Wardshaven planned. The Enterprise, practically a duplicate of the Nemesis, carried everything that would be needed to get it started when she was pirated. When she was— Now you're going to have to tell the gentleman the truth, Harkaman chuckled. I intend to. He laid his cigar down, sipped some of his brandy, and explained about Duke Angus' Tanith adventure. It was part of a larger plan. Angus wanted to gain economic supremacy for Wardshaven to forward his political ambitions. It was, however, an entirely practical business proposition. I was opposed to it, because I thought it would be too good a proposition for Tanith and work to the disadvantage of the home planet in the end. He told them about the Enterprise and the cargo of industrial and construction equipment she carried, and then told them how Andray Dunnan had pirated her. That wouldn't have annoyed me at all. I had no money invested in the project. What did annoy me, to put it mildly, was that just before he took the ship out, Dunnan shot up my wedding, wounded me and my father-in-law, and killed the lady to whom I had been married for less than half an hour. I fitted out this ship at my own expense, took on Captain Harkaman, who had been left without a command when the Enterprise was pirated, and came out here to hunt Dunnan down and kill him. I believe that I can do that best by establishing a base on Tanith myself. The base will have to be operated at a profit, or it can't be operated at all. He picked up the cigar again and puffed slowly. I am inviting you gentlemen to join me as partners. Well, you still haven't told us how we're going to get the money to finance it, Spaso insisted. The Duke of Wardshaven and the others who invested in the original Tanith adventure will put it up. It's the only way they can recover what they lost on the Enterprise. But then, this Duke of Wardshaven will be running it, not us, Valkenhayn objected. The Duke of Wardshaven, Harkaman reminded him, is on Graham. We are here on Tanith. There are 3,000 light years between. That seemed a satisfactory answer. Spasso, however, wanted to know who would run things here on Tanith. We'll have to hold a meet. Ing of all 3 crews, he began. We will do nothing of the kind, Trask told him. I will be running things here on Tanith. You people may allow your orders to be debated and voted on, but I don't. You will inform your respective crews to that effect. Any orders you give them in my name will be obeyed without argument. I don't know how the men'll take that, Valkenhayn said. I know how they'll take it if they're smart. Ha. Urkamen told him. And I know what'll happen if they aren't. I know how you've been running your ships, or how your ship's crews have been running you. Well, we don't do it that way. Lucas Trask is owner and I'm captain. I obey his orders on what's to be done, and everybody else obeys mine on how to do it. Spasso looked at Valkenhayn, then shrugged. That's how the man wants it, Boke. You want to give him an argument. I don't. First order, Trask said, is that these people you have working here are to be paid. They are not to be beaten by these plug-uglies you have guarding them. If any of them want to leave, they may do so. They will be given presents and furnished transportation home. Those who wish to stay will be issued rations, furnished with clothing and bedding and so on as they need it, and paid wages. We'll work out some kind of a pay token system and set up a commissary where they can buy things. Discs of plastic or titanium or something, stamped and uncounterfeitable. Get Alvin Carford to see about that. Organize work gangs and promote the best and most intelligent to foremen. And those guards could be taken in hand by some ground fighter sergeant and given sword world weapons and tactical training. Use them to train others. They'd need a sepoy army of some sort. Eva. The best of goodwill is no substitute for armed force, conspicuously displayed and unhesitatingly used when necessary. And there'll be no more of this raiding villages for food or anything else. We will pay for anything we get from any of the locals. We'll have trouble about that, Valkenhayn predicted. Our men think anything a local has belongs to anybody who can take it. So do I, Harkaman said. On a planet Raiding. This is our planet and our locals. We don't raid our own planet or our own people. You'll just have to teach them that. It took Valkenhayn and Spasso more time and argument to convince their crews than Trask thought necessary. Harkaman seemed satisfied, and so was Baron Rathmore, the Wardshaven politician. It's like talking a lot of uncommitted small landholders into taking somebody's livery and maintenance. The latter said, you can't use too much pressure, make them think it's their own idea. There were meetings of both crews with heated arguments. Baron Rathmore made frequent speeches while Lord Trask of Tanith and Admiral Harkaman, the titles were Rathmore's suggestion, remained loftily aloof. On both ships, everybody owned everything in common, which meant that nobody owned anything. They had taken over Tanith on the same basis of diffused ownership, and nobody in either crew was quite stupid enough to think that they could do anything with the planet by themselves. By joining the Nemesis, it appeared that they were getting something for nothing. In the end, they voted to place themselves under the authority of Lord Trask and Admiral Harkaman. After all, Tanith would be a feudal lordship, and the 3 ships together a fleet. Admiral Harkaman's first act of authority was to order a general inspection of fleet units. He wasn't shocked by the condition of the 2 ships, but that was only because he had expected much worse. They were space-worthy. After all, they had gotten here from Hoth under their own power. They were only combat-worthy if the combat weren't too severe. His original estimate that the Nemesis could have knocked both of them to pieces was, if anything, over-conservative. The engines were in fair shape, and the armament was bad. We aren't going to spend our time sitting here on Tanith, he told the 2 captains. This planet is a raiding base, and raiding is the operative word, and we are not going to raid easy planets. A planet that can be raided with impunity isn't worth the time it takes getting to it. We are going to have to fight on every planet we hit, and I am not going to jeopardize the lives of the men under me, which includes your crews as well as mine because of underpowered and underarmed ships. Spasso tried to argue. We've been getting along. Harkaman cursed. Yes, I know how you've been getting along, chicken stealing on planets like Set and Zippatodak and Melkarth. Not making enough to cover maintenance expenses, that's why your ship's in the shape she is. Well, those days are over. Both ships ought to have a full overhaul. But we'll have to skip that till we have a shipyard of our own. But I will insist, at least, that your guns and launchers are in order. And your detection equipment, You didn't get a fix on the Nemesis till we were less than 20,000 miles off-planet. We had better get the Lamia in condition first, Trask said. We can put her on off-planet watch instead of that pair of pinnaces. Work on the Lamia started the next day and can see. Dribble friction heat was generated between her officers and the engineers sent over from the Nemesis. Baron Rathmore went aboard and came back laughing. You know how that ship's run? He asked. There's a sort of Soviet of officers, chief engineer, exec, guns and missiles, astrogator, and so on. Spasso's just an animated ventriloquist's dummy. I talked to all of them. None of them can pin me down to anything, but they think. We're going to heave Spasso out of command and appoint one of them, and each one thinks he'll be it. I don't know how long that'll last. It's a string-end tape job like the one we're having to do on the ship. It'll hold till we get something better. We'll have to get rid of Spasso, Harkaman agreed. I think we'll put one of our own people in his place. Valkenhayn can stay in command of the Space Scourge. He's a spaceman. But Spasso's no good for anything. The local problem was complicated, too. The locals spoke lingua terra of a sort, like every descendant of the race that had gone out from the Sol system in the 3rd century, but it was a barely comprehensible sort. On civilized planets, the language had been frozen unalterably in microbooks and voice tapes. But microbooks can only be read and sound tapes heard with the aid of electricity. And Aneth had lost that long ago. Most of the people Spasso and Valkenhayn had kidnapped and enslaved came from villages within a radius of 500 miles. About half of them wanted to be repatriated. They were given gifts of knives, tools, blankets, and bits of metal which seemed to be the chief standard of value and medium of exchange, and shipped home. Finding their proper villages was not easy. At each such village, the news was spread that the Space Vikings would hereafter pay for what they received. The Lamia was overhauled as rapidly as possible. She was still far from being a good ship, but she was much closer to being one than before. She was fitted with the best detection equipment that could be assembled and put on orbit. Alvin Carford took command of her, with some of Spasso's officers, some of Valkenhayn's, and a few from the Nemesis. Harkaman was intending to use her for retraining of all the Lamia and Space Scourge officers, and rotated them back and forth. The labor guards, a score in number, were relieved of their duties, issued Sword World firearms, and given intensive training. The trade tokens, stamps of colored plastic, were introduced, and a store was set up where they could be exchanged for Sword World items. After a while, it dawned on the locals that the tokens could also be used for trading among themselves. Money seemed to have been one of the adjuncts of civilization that had been lost along Tanith's downward path. A few of them were able to use contragravity handlifters and hand-towed lifter skids. Several were even learning to operate things like bulldozers, at least to the extent of knowing which lever or button did what. Give them a little time, Trask thought, watching a gang at work day. Out on the spaceport floor, it won't be many years before half of them will be piloting aircars. As soon as the Lamia was on orbital watch, the Space Scourge was set down at the spaceport, and work started on her. It was decided that Valkenhayn would take her to Graham. Enough Nemesis people would go along to ensure good faith on his part, and to talk to Duke Angus and the Tanith investors. Baron Rathmore and Patrick Morland, and several other ward-shaven gentleman adventurers for the latter function. Alvin Carford to act as Valkenhayn's exec, with private orders to supersede him in command if necessary, and Gwot Kirby to do the astrogating. We'll have to take the Nemesis and the Space Scourge out first and make a big raid, Harkaman said. We can't send the Space Scourge back to Graham empty. When Baron Rathmore and Lord Valpry and the rest of them talk to Duke Angus and the Tanith investors, they'll have to have a lot more than some travel films of Tanith. They'll have to be able to show that Tanith is producing. We ought to have a little money of our own to invest, too. But, Otto, both ships, that worried Trask. Suppose Dunnan comes and finds nobody here but Spasso and the Lamia? Chance we'll have to take. Personally, I think we have a year to a year and a half before Dunnan shows up. Here, I know we were fooled trying to guess what he'd do before. But the sort of raid I have in mind will need 2 ships, and in any case, I don't want to leave both those ships here while we're gone, even if you do. When it comes to that, I don't think I do either. But we can't trust Spasso here alone, can we? We'll leave enough of our people to make sure. We'll leave Alvin. That'll mean a lot of work for me that he'd otherwise do on the ship. And Baron Rathmore and young Valkyrie and the men who have been training our sepoys. We can shuffle things around and leave some of Valkenhayn's men in place of some of Spasso's. We might even talk Spasso into going along. That'll mean having to endure him at our table, but it would be wise. Have you picked a place to raid? 3 of them. First, Kepra, that's only 30 light years from here. That won't out to much, just chicken stealing. It'll give our green hands some relatively safe combat training, and it'll give us some idea of how Spasso's and Valkenhayn's people behave and give them confidence for the next job. And then, Amaterasu. My information about Amaterasu is about 20 years old. A lot of things can happen in 20 years. All I know of it, I was never there myself, is it's fairly civilized about. Like Terra just before the beginning of the atomic era. No nuclear energy, they lost that, and of course nothing beyond it. But they have hydroelectric and solar electric power, and non-nuclear jet aircraft, and some very good chemical explosive weapons, which they use very freely on each other. It was last known to have been raided by a ship from Excalibur 20 years ago. That sounds promising. And the third planet? Bea. Ulf, we won't take enough damage on Amaterasu to make any difference there, but if we saved Amaterasu for last, we might be needing too many repairs. It's like that? Yes, they have nuclear energy. I don't think it would be wise to mention Beowulf to Captain Spasso and Valkenhayn. Wait till we've hit Kepra and Amaterasu. They may be feeling like heroes then. Kepra left a bad taste in Trask's mouth. He was still tasting it when the colored turbulence died out of the screen and left the gray nothingness of hyperspace. Garvan Spasso, it had no trouble in inducing him to come along, was staring avidly at the screen as though he could still see the ravished planet they had left. That was a good one. That was a good one. He was crowing. He'd said that a dozen times since they had lifted out. 3 cities in 5 days and all the stuff we gathered up. Round them, we took over 2 million stellars, and did 10 times as much damage getting it, and there was no scale of values by which to compute the death and suffering. Knock it off, Spasso. You said that before. There was a time when he wouldn't have spoken to the fellow or anybody else like that. Gresham's law extended. Bad manners drive out good manners. Spasso turned on him indignantly. You think you are, he thinks. He's Lord Trask of Tanith, Harkaman said. He's right, too, he is. He looked searchingly at Trask for a moment, then turned back to Spasso. I'm just as tired as he is of hearing you pop your mouth about a lousy 2 million stellars. Nearer 1.5 million, but 2 million's nothing to pop about. Maybe it would be for the Lamia, but we have a 3-ship fleet and a planetary base to meet expenses on. Out of this raid, a grow. And fighter or an able spaceman will get 150 stellars. We'll get about 1,000 ourselves. How long do you think we can stay in business doing this kind of chicken stealing? You call this chicken stealing? I call it chicken stealing, and soul you before we get back to Tanith, if you live that long. For a moment, Spasso was still affronted. Then, temporarily, his vulpine face showed avaricious hope, and then apprehension. Evidently, he knew Otto Harkaman's reputation, and some of the things Harkaman had done weren't his idea of an easy way to make money. Kepra had been easy. The locals hadn't had anything to fight with. Small arms and light cannon which hadn't been able to fire more than a few rounds. Wherever they had attempted resistance, the combat cars had swooped in, dropping bombs and firing machine guns and autocannon. Yet they had fought. Bitterly and hopelessly, just as he would have, defending Traskin. Trask busied himself getting coffee and a cigarette from one of the robots. When he looked up, Spasso had gone away and Harkaman was sitting on the edge of the desk, loading his short pipe. Well, you saw the elephant, Lucas, Harkaman said. You don't seem to have liked it. Elephant? Old Terran expression I read somewhere. All I know is that an elephant was an animal about the size of one of your gram megathers. The expression means experiencing something for the first time which makes a great impression. Elephants must have been something to see. This was your first Viking raid. You've seen it now. He'd been in combat before. He'd led the fighting men of Traskin during the boundary dispute with Baron Manuel, and there were always bandits and cattle rustlers. He'd thought it would be like that. He remembered 5 A's, or was it 5 ages ago, his excited anticipation as the city grew and spread in the screen, and the nemesis came dropping down toward it. The pinnaces, his 4 and the 2 from the space scourge, had gone spiraling out 100 miles beyond the city. The space scourge had gone into a tighter circle 20 miles from its center. The nemesis had continued her relentless descent until she was 10 miles from the ground before. She began spewing out landing craft and combat cars and the little egg-shaped one-man air cavalry mounts. It had been thrilling. Everything had gone perfectly, not even Valkenhayn's gang had goofed. Then the screen views had begun coming in. The brief and hopeless fight in the city. He could still see that silly little field gun. It must have been around 70 or 80 millimeter on a high-wheeled carriage, drawn by 6 shaggy, bandy-leg. It beasts. They had gotten it unlimbered and were trying to get it on a target when a rocket from an air car landed directly under the muzzle. Gun, caisson, crew, even the draft team 50 yards behind had simply vanished. Or the little company, some of them women, trying to defend the top of a tall and half-ruinous building with rifles and pistols. One air cavalryman wiped them all out with his machine guns. They don't have a chance. He'd said, half-sick, but they keep on fighting. Yes, stupid of them, isn't it? Harkaman beside him had said. What would you do in their place? Fight. Try to kill as many Space Vikings as I could before they got me. Terro-humans are all stupid like that. That's why we're human. If the taking of the city had been a massacre, the sack that had followed had been a man-made hell. He had gone down along with Harkaman while the fighting, if it could be so called, was still going on. Harkaman had suggested that the men ought to see him moving about among them. For his own part, he had felt a compulsion to share their guilt. He and Sir Patrick Morland had been on foot together in one of the big hollow buildings that had stood since Khepera had been a member republic of the Terran Federation. The air was acrid with smoke, powder smoke, and the smoke of burning. It was surprising. How much would burn in this city of concrete and vitrified stone? It was surprising, too, how well-kept everything was, at least on the ground level. These people had taken pride in their city. They found themselves alone in a great empty hallway. The noise and horror of the sack had moved away from them, or they from it. And then, when they entered a side hall, they saw a man, one of the locals, squatting on the floor with the body of a woman. And cradled on his lap. She was dead, half her head had been blown off, but he was clasping her tightly, her blood staining his shirt and sobbing heartbrokenly. A carbine lay forgotten on the floor beside him. Poor devil, Morland said and started forward. No, Trask stopped him with his left hand. With his right he drew his pistol and shot the man dead. Morland was horrified. Great Satan, Lucas, why did you do that? I wish Andray Dunnan had done that for me. He thumbed the safety on and holstered the pistol. None of this would be happening if he had. How many more Happinesses do you think we've smashed here today? And we don't even have Dunnan's excuse of madness. The next morning, with everything of value collected and sent aboard, they had started cross-country for 500 miles to another city, the first 100 over a countryside, Smoke from burning villages Valkenhayn's men had pillaged the night before. There was no warning. Khepera had lost electricity and radio and telegraph, and the spread of news was at the speed of one of the beasts the locals insisted on calling horses. By mid-afternoon, they had finished with that city. It had been as bad as the first one. One thing, it was the center of a considerable cattle country. The cattle were native to the planet, heavy, odded unicorns the size of a gram bisonoid, or one of the slightly mutated Terran carabaos on Tanith, with long hair like a Terran yak. He had detailed a dozen of the Nemesis ground fighters who had been vaqueros on his Trascan ranches to collect a score of cows and 4 likely bulls, with enough fodder to last them on the voyage. The odds were strongly against any of them living to acclimate themselves to Tanith, but if they did, it might prove to be one of the most valuable pieces of loot from Khepera. The third city was at the forks of a river, like Tradetown on Tanith. Unlike it, this was a real metropolis. They should have gone there first of all. They spent 2 days systematically pillaging it. The Kheperans carried on considerable river traffic, with stern-wheel steamboats, and the waterfront was lined with warehouses crammed with every sort of merchandise. Even the Kheperans had money, and for the most part it was gold specie, and the bank vaults were full of it. Unfortunately, the city had been built since the fall of the Federation, and the climb up from the barbarism that had followed, and a great deal of it was of wood. Fires started almost at once, and it was almost completely on fire by the end of the second day. It had been visible in the telescopic screen even after they were out of atmosphere, a black smear until the turning planet carried it into darkness, and then a lurid glow. It was a filthy business. Harkaman nodded. Robbery and murder always are. You don't have to ask me who said that Space Vikings are professional robbers and murderers, but who was it said that he didn't care how many planets were raided and how many innocents massacred in the old Federation? A dead man. Lucas Trask of Traskin. Who wish now that you'd kept Traskin and stayed on Graham? No. If I had, I'd have spent every hour wishing I was doing what I'm doing now. I can get used to this, I suppose. I think you will. At least you kept your rations down. I didn't on my first raid and had bad dreams about it for a year. He gave his coffee cup back to the robot and got to his feet. Get a little rest for a couple of hours, then draw some alkadote. Item in pills from the medic. As soon as things are secured, there'll be parties all over the ship, and we'll be expected to look in on every one of them, have a drink, and say, "Well done, boys." Elaine came to him while he was resting. She looked at him in horror, and he tried to hide his face from her, and then realized that he was trying to hide it from himself. They came straight down on Eglansby, on Amaterasu, the Nemesis, and the Space Scourge side by side. The radar had picked them up at 0.5 light seconds. By this time, the whole planet knew they were coming, and nobody was wondering why. Paul Koref was monitoring at least 20 radio stations, assigning somebody to each one as it was identified. What was coming in was uniformly excited, some panicky, and all in fairly standard lingua terra. Garvan Spasso was perturbed. So, in the communication screen from the Space Scourge was Boke Valkenhayn. They got radio and they got radar, he clamored. Well, so what? Harkaman asked. They had radio and radar 20 years ago when Rock Morgan was here in the coal sack, but they don't have nuclear energy, do they? Well, no, I'm picking up a lot of industrial electrical discharge, but nothing nuclear. All right, a man with a club can lick a man with his fists, a man with a gun can lick half a dozen with clubs, and 2 ships with nuclear weapons can lick a whole planet without them. Think it's time, Lucas, he nodded. Paul, can you cut in on that Eglansby station yet? What are you going to do? Valkenhayn wanted to know against it in advance. Summon them to surrender. If they don't, we will drop a hellburner, and then we will pick out another city and summon it to surrender. I don't think the second one will refuse. If we are going to be murderers, we'll do it right this time. Valkenhayn was aghast, probably at the idea of burning an unlooted city. Spasso was sputtering something about. Teach the dirty neobarbs a lesson. Koref told him he was switched on. He picked up a hand phone. Space Vikings Nemesis and Space Scourge calling the city of Eglansby. Space Vikings. He repeated it for a minute. There was no reply. Van, he called guns and missiles. A subcrit display job about 4 miles over the city. He laid the phone down and looked to the underside view screen. A little later, a silvery shape dropped away from the ship's south pole. The telescopic screen went off and the unmagnified screen darkened as the filters went on. Valkenhayn, aboard the other ship, was shouting a warning about his own screens. The only unfiltered screen aboard the Nemesis was the one tuned to the falling missile. The city of Eglansby rushed upward in it, and then it went suddenly dark. There was an orange-yellow blaze in the other screens. After a while, the filters went off and the telescopic screen went on again. He picked up the phone. Space Vikings calling Eglansby. This is your last warning. Communicate at once. Less than a minute later, a voice came out of one of the speakers. Eglansby calling Space Vikings. Your bomb has done great damage. Will you hold your fire until somebody in authority can communicate with you? This is the chief operator at the Central State Telecast Station. I have no authority to say anything to you or discuss anything. Oh, good. That sounds like a dictatorship, Harkaman was saying. Grab the dictator and shove a pistol in his face and you have everything. There is nothing to discuss. Get somebody who has authority to surrender the city to us. If this is not done within the hour, the city and everybody in it will be obliterated. Only minutes later, a new voice said, This is Gonzales Jan, secretary to Pedrosan Pedro, president of the Council of Syndics. We will switch President Pedrosan over as soon as he can speak directly to the personage in supreme command of your ships. That is mice. Elf, switch him to me at once. After a delay of less than 15 seconds, they had President Pedrosan Pedro. We are prepared to resist, But we realize what this would cost in lives and destruction of property, he began. You don't begin to. You know anything about nuclear weapons? From history, we have no nuclear power of any sort. We can find no fissionables on this planet. The cost, as you put it, would be everything and everybody in Eglonsby and for a radius of almost 100 miles. Are you still prepared to resist? The president of the Council of Syndics wasn't and said so. Trask asked him how much authority his position gave him. I have all powers in any emergency. I think, the voice added tonelessly, that this is an emergency. The council will automatically ratify any decision I make. Harkaman depressed a button in front. What I said, dictatorship with parliamentary false front. If he isn't a false front dictator for some oligarchy. He motioned to Harkaman to take his thumb off the button. How large is this council? 16, elected by the syndicates they represent. There is the Syndicate of Labor, the Syndicate of Manufacturers, the Syndicate of Small Businesses, the corporate state, 1st century pre-atomic on Terra. Beh. Neither moose, Harkaman said. Let's all go down and talk to them. When they were sure that the public had been warned to make no resistance, the Nemesis went down to 2 miles, bulking over the center of the city. The buildings were low by the standards of a contragravity-using people, the highest barely 1,000 feet and few over 500, and they were more closely set than sword-worlders were accustomed to, with broad roadways in several places there were queer arrangements of crossed roadways, apparently leading nowhere. Harkaman laughed when he saw them. Airstrips. I've seen them on other planets where they've lost contragravity, for winged aircraft powered by chemical fuel. I hope we have time for me to look around here. I'll bet they even have railroads here. The great damage caused by the bomb was about equal to the effect of a medium hurricane. He had seen worse from high winds at Traskin. Mostly it had been moral, which had been the kind intended. They met President Pedrossen and the Council of Syndics in a spacious and well-furnished chamber near the top of one of the medium-high buildings. Valkenhayn was surprised. In a loud aside, he considered that these people must be almost civilized. They were introduced. Amaterasuan surnames preceded personal names, which hint at a culture and a political organization making much use of registration by alphabetical list. They all wore garments which had the indefinable but unmistakable appearance of uniforms. When they had all seated themselves at a large oval table, Harkaman drew his pistol and used the butt for a gavel. Lord Trask, will you deal with these people directly? He asked, stiffly formal. Certainly, Admiral. He spoke to the President, ignoring the others. We want it understood that we control this city and we expect complete submission. As long as you remain submissive to us, we will do no damage beyond removal of the things we wish to take from it, and there will be no violence to any of your people, or any indiscriminate vandalism. This visit we are paying you will cost you heavily, make no mistake about that, but whatever the cost, it will be a cheap price for avoiding what we might otherwise do. The President and the Syndics exchanged relieved glances. Let the taxpayers worry about the cost, they'd come out of it with whole skins. You understand, we want maximum value and minimum bulk, he continued. Jewels, objects of art, furs, the better grades of luxury goods of all kinds, rare element metals, and monetary metals, gold and platinum. You have 'em. Italic-based currency, I suppose? Oh, no, President Pedrossen was slightly scandalized. Our currency is based on services to society. Our monetary unit is simply called a credit. Harkaman snorted impolitely. Evidently he'd seen economic systems like that before. Trask wanted to know if they used gold or platinum at all. Gold, to some extent, for jewelry. Evidently they weren't complete economic. Puritans, and platinum in industry, of course. If they want gold, they should have raided Stalgoland, one of the syndics said. They have a gold standard currency. From the way he said it, he might have been accusing them of eating with their fingers and possibly of eating their own young. I know, the maps we're using for this planet are a few centuries old. Stalgoland doesn't seem to appear on them. I wish it didn't appear on ours, Eth. That was General Dagro Ector, Syndic for State Protection. It would have been a good thing for this whole planet if you'd decided to raid them instead of us, somebody else said. It isn't too late for these gentlemen to make that decision, Pedrossen said. I gather that gold is a monetary metal among your people. When Trask nodded, he continued. It is also the basis of the Stolgonian currency. The actual currency is pay. Ipper, theoretically redeemable in gold. In actuality, the circulation of gold has been prohibited, and the entire gold wealth of the nation is concentrated in vaults at 3 depositories. We know exactly where they are. You begin to interest me, President Pedrossen. I do? Well, you have 2 large spaceships and 6 smaller craft. You have nuclear weapons, something nobody on this planet has. You have contragravity, something that is hardly more than a legend here. On the other hand, we have 1.5 million ground troops, jet aircraft, armored ground vehicles, and chemical weapons. If you will undertake to attack Stalgoland, we will place this entire force at your disposal. General Dagro will command them as you direct. All that we ask is that, when you have loaded the gold hoards of Stalgoland aboard your ships, you will leave our troops in possession of the country. That was all there was to that meeting. There was a second one. Only Trask, Harkaman, and Sir Patrick Morland represented the Space Vikings, and the Eglansby government was represented by President Pedrossen and General Dagro. They met more intimately in a smaller and more luxurious room in the same building. If you're going to declare war on Stalgoland, you'd better get along with it, Morland advised. What? Ped. Rossen seemed to have only the vaguest idea of what he was talking about. You mean warn them? Certainly not. We will attack them by surprise. It will be nothing but plain self-defense, he added righteously. The oligarchic capitalists of Stalgoland have been plotting to attack us for years. Yes, if you had carried out your original intention of looting Eglansby, they would have invaded us the moment your ships lifted out. It's exactly what I'd do in their place. But you maintain nominally friendly relations with them. Of course, we are civilized, the peace-loving government and people of Eglansby. Yes, Mr. President, I understand, and they have an embassy here. They call it that, cried Dagro. It is a nest of vipers, a plague spot of espionage and subversion. We'll grab that ourselves right away, Harkaman said. You won't be able to round up all their agents outside it, and if we tried to, it would cause suspicion. We'll have to put up a front to deceive them. Yes, you will go on the air at once, calling on the people to collaborate with us, and you will specifically order your troops mobilized to assist us in collecting the tribute we are levying on Eglansby, Trask said. In that way, if any Stalgonian spies see your troops concentrated around our landing craft, they think it's to help us load our loot. And we'll announce that a large part of the tribute will consist of military equipment, Dagro added. That will explain why our guns and tanks are being loaded on your contragravity vehicles. When the Stalgonian embassy was seized by the Space Vikings, the ambassador asked to be taken at once to their leader. He had a proposition. If the Space Vikings would completely disable the army of Eglansby and admit Stalgonian troops when they were ready to leave, the invaders would bring with them 10,000 kilos of gold. Trask affected to be very hospitable to the offer. Stalgoland lay across a narrow and shallow sea from the state of Eglansby. It was dotted with islands, and every one of them was, in turn, dotted with oil wells. Petroleum was what kept the aircraft and ground vehicles of Amaterasu in operation. Oil, other than ideology, was at the root of the enmity between the two nations. Apparently, the Stalgonian espionage in Eglansby was completely deceived, and the reports Trask allowed the captive ambassador to make confirmed the deception. Hourly, the Eglansby radio stations poured out exhortations to the people to cooperate with the Space Vikings, with an occasional lamentation about the masses of war materials being taken. Eglansby. Espionage in Stalgoland was similarly active. The Stalgonian armies were being massed at 4 seaports on the coast facing Eglansby, and there was a frantic gathering of every sort of ship available. By this time, any sympathy that Trask might have felt for either party had evaporated. The invasion of Stalgoland started the 5th morning after their arrival over Eglansby. Before dawn, the 6 pinnaces went in, making a wide sweep around the curvature of the planet and coming in from the north, 2 to each of the 3 gold troves. They were detected by radar, eventually but too late for any effective resistance to be organized. 2 were even taken without a shot. By mid-morning, all 3 had been blown open, and the ingots and specie were being removed. The 4 seaports from whence the Stalgonian invasion of Eglansby was to have been launched were new. neutralized by nuclear bombing. Neutralized was a nice word, Trask thought. There was no echo in it of the screams of the still living, maimed and burned and blinded, around the fringes of Ground Zero. The Nemesis and the Space Scourge, from landing craft and from the ships themselves, landed Eglantspy troops on Stalgonopolis. While they were sacking the city with all the usual atrocities, the Space Vikings were loading the gold and anything else that was of more than ordinary value aboard the ships. They were still at it the next morning when President Pedrosin arrived at the newly conquered capital, announcing his intention of putting the Stolgonian chief of state and his cabinet on trial as war criminals. Before sunset, they were back over Eglantspy. The loot might run as high as 500 million Excalibur stellars. Boke, Valkenhayn, and Garvan Spasso were simply beyond astonishment and beyond words. The looting of Eglantspy then began. They gathered up machinery and stocks of steel and light metal alloys. The city was full of warehouses, and the warehouses were crammed with valuables. In spite of the socialistic and egalitarian verbiage behind which the government operated, there seemed to be a numerous elite class, and if gold were not a monetary metal, it was not despised for purposes of ostentation. There were several large art museums. Van Larch, their nearest approach to an art specialist, took charge of culling the best from them, and there was a vast public library. Into this, Otto Harkaman vanished with 6 men and a contragravity scow. Its historical section would be much poorer in the future. President Pedro was on the radio from Stalgonopolis that night. "Is this how you Space Vikings eat faith?" he demanded indignantly. "You've abandoned me and my army here in Stalgoland, and you're sacking Eglantspy. You promised to leave Eglantspy alone if I helped you get the gold of Stalgoland." "I promised nothing of the kind. I promised to help you take Stalgoland. You've taken it," Trask told him. "I promised to avoid unnecessary damage or violence. I've already hanged 12 of my own men for rape, murder, and wanton vandalism. Now we expect to be out of here in 24 hours. You'd better be back here before then. Your own people are starting to loot. We did not promise to control them for you." That was true. What few troops had been left behind, and the police were unable to cope with the mobs that were pillaging in the wake of the Space Vikings. Everybody seemed to be trying to grab what he could and let the Vikings be blamed. For it, he had been able to keep his own people in order. There had been at least 12 cases of rape and wanton murder, and the offenders had been promptly hanged. None of their shipmates, not even the Space Scourge Company, seemed resentful. They felt the culprits had deserved what they'd gotten, not for what they'd done to the locals, but for disobeying orders. A few troops had been flown in from Stalgoland by the time they had got. Their vehicles stowed and were lifting out. They didn't seem to be making much headway. Harkaman, who had gotten his load of microbooks stowed and was at the command desk, laughed heartily. "I don't know what Pedrosin will do. Gehenna, I don't even know what I'd do if I'd gotten myself into a mess like that. He'll probably bring half his army back, leave the other half in Stalgoland, and lose both. Suppose we drop in about 3 or 4 years, just out of curiosity. If we make 20% of what we did this time, the trip would pay for itself." After they went into hyperspace and had the ship secured, the parties lasted 3 galactic standard days, and nobody was at all sober. Harkaman was drooling over the mass of historical material he had found. Spasso was jubilant. Nobody could call this chicken stealing. He kept repeating that as long as he was able to say anything. Kepra, he conceded, had been lousy 2 or 3 million stellars. Pooh, Beowulf was bad. Valkenhayn and Spasso had both been opposed to the raid. Nobody raided Beowulf. Beowulf was too tough. Beowulf had nuclear energy and nuclear weapons and contragravity and normal spacecraft. They even had colonies on a couple of other planets of their system. They had everything but hypered. Beowulf was a civilized planet, and you didn't raid civilized planets, not and get away with it. And beside, hadn't they gotten enough loot on Amaterasu? No, we did not, Trask told them. If we're going to make anything out of Tanith, we're going to need power, and I don't mean windmills and water wheels. As you've remarked, Beowulf has nuclear energy. That's where we get our plutonium and our power units. So, they went to Beowulf. They came out of hyperspace 8 light hours from the F7 star, of which Beowulf was the 4th planet, and 20 light minutes apart. Gwot Kirby made a micro-jump that brought the ships within practical communicating distance, and they began making plans in an inter-ship screen conference. There are, or were, 3 chief sources of fissionable ores, Harkaman said. The last ship to raid here and get away? A Stefan Kintor's Princess of Lyoness, 60 years ago. He hit one on the Antarctic continent. According to his account, everything there was fairly new. He didn't mess things up too badly, and it ought to be still operating. We'll go in from the South Pole, and we'll have to go in fast. They shifted personnel and equipment. They would go in bunched, the pinnaces ahead. They and the Space Scourge would go down to the ground, while the better armed nemesis would hover above to fight off local contragravity, shoot down missiles, and generally provide overhead cover. Trask transferred to the Space Scourge, taking with him Moreland and 200 of the Nemesis ground fighters. Most of the single mounts, landing craft and manipulators and heavy-duty lifters went with him, jamming the decks around the vehicle ports of Valkenhayn's ship. They jumped in to 6 light minutes, and, while Valkenhayn's astrogator was still fiddling with his controls, they began sensing radar and microray detection. When they came out again, they were 2 light seconds off the South Pole, and half a dozen ships were either in orbit or coming up from the planet. All normal spacecraft, of course, but some were almost as big as the Nemesis. From there on, it was a nightmare. Ships pounded at them with guns, and they pounded back. Missiles went out, and counter-missiles stopped them in rapidly expanding and quickly vanishing globes of light. Red lights flashed on the damage board, and sirens howled and klaxons squawked. In the outside view screens, they saw the Nemesis vanish in a blaze of radiance, and then, while their hearts were still in their throats, come out of it again. Red lights went off on the board as damage control crews and their robots sealed the breaches in the hull and pumped air back into evacuated areas, and then more red lights came on. Occasionally, he would glance toward Boke Valkenhayn, who sat motionless in his chair, chewing a cigar that had gone out long ago. He wasn't enjoying it, but he wasn't showing fear. Once a Beowulfer vanished in a supernova flash, and when the ball of incandescence widened to nothing, the ship was gone. All Valkenhayn said was, "Hope one of our boys did." That, they fought their way in and down toward the atmosphere. Another Beowulf ship blew up, a craft about the size of Spasso's Lamia. A moment later, another. Valkenhayn was pounding the desk in front of him with his fist and yelling, "That was one of ours. Find out who launched it. Get his name?" Missiles were coming up from the planet now. Valkenhayn's detection officer was trying to locate the source. While he was trying, a big, Ellen-shaped thing fell away from the Nemesis, and in the jiggling, radiation-distorted intership screen, Harkaman's image was laughing. Hellburner just went off. Target about 50 degrees south, 25 degrees east of the sunrise line. That's where those missiles are coming from. Counter-missiles sped toward the big metal melon. Defense missiles, robot-launched, met them. The Hellburner's track was marked first by expanding red and orange globes in airless space, and then by fire puffs after it entered atmosphere. It vanished into the darkness beyond the sunset, and then made sunlight of its own. It was sunlight, a Beth solar phoenix reaction, and it would sustain itself for hours. He hoped it hadn't landed within 1,000 miles of their objective. The ground operation was a nightmare of a different sort. He went down in a command car with Patrick Moreland and a couple of others. There were missiles and gun batteries. There were darting patterns of flights of combat vehicles, blazing gunfire, and single vehicles that shot past or blew up in front of them. Robots on contragravity, military robots with missiles to launch, and working robots with only their own mass to hurl, flung themselves mindlessly at them. Screens that went crazy from radiation, speakers that jabbered contradictory orders. Finally, the battle, which had raged in the air over 2,000 square miles of mines and refineries and reaction plants, became 2 distinct and concentrated battles, one at the packing plant and storage vaults, and one at the power unit cartridge factory. 3 pinnaces came down to form a triangle over each. The Space Scourge hung midway between, poured out a swarm of vehicles and big claw-armed manipulators, armored Eiders and landing craft shuttled back and forth. The command car looped and dodged from one target to the other. At one, keg-like canisters of plutonium, collapsium-plated and weighing tons apiece, were coming out of the vaults. and at the other lifters were bringing out loads of nuclear-electric power unit cartridges, some as big as a 10-liter jar, to power a spaceship engine, and some small as a round of pistol ammunition, for things like flashlights. Every hour or so he looked at his watch, and it would be 3 or 4 minutes later. At last, when he was completely convinced that he had really been killed, and was damned and would spend all eternity in this fire-riven chaos, the Nemesis began firing red flares, and the speakers in all the vehicles were signaling recall. He got aboard the Space Scourge somehow, after assuring himself that nobody who was alive was left behind. There were 20-odd who weren't, and the sick bay was full of wounded who had gone up with cargo, and more were being helped off the vehicles as they were berthed. The car in which he had been riding had been hit several times, and one of the gunners was bleeding under his helmet and didn't seem aware of it. When he got to the command room, he found Boak Valkenhayn, his face drawn and weary, getting coffee from a robot and icing it with brandy. "That's it," he said, blowing on the steaming cup. It was the battered silver one that had been in front of him when he had first appeared in the Nemesis screen. He nodded toward the damaged screen. Everything had been patched up, or the outer decks around breached portions of the hull sealed. "Ship secure." He set down the silver mug and lit a cigar. To quote Garvan Spasso, nobody can call that chicken stealing. No, not even if you count Tizona giraffe birds as chickens. That Graham Gumpear brandy you're putting in that coffee? I'll have the same. Just leave out the coffee. The Lamia's detection picked them up as soon as they were out of the last microjump. Trask's gnawing fear that Dunnan might attack in their absence had been groundless. Incredibly, he realized, they had been gone only 30-odd galactic standard days, and in that time Alvin Carford had done an incredible amount of work. He had gotten the spaceport completely cleared of rubble and debris, and he had the woods cleared away from around it and the 2 tall buildings. The locals called the city Riven. A few inscriptions found here and there in it indicated that the original name had been Rivington. He had done considerable mapping, in some detail of the continent on which it was located and, in general, of the rest of the planet. And he had established friendly relations with the people of Tradetown and made friends with their king. Nobody, not even those who had collected it, quite believed their eyes when the loot was unloaded. The little herd of long-haired unicorns, the Kepera locals had called them Craigs, probably a corruption of the name of some naturalist who had first studied them, had come through the voyage and even the Battle of Beowulf in good shape. Trask and a few of his former cattlemen from Traskin watched them anxiously, and the ship's doctor, acting veterinarian, made elaborate tests of vegetation they would be likely to eat. 3 of the cows proved to be with calf. These were isolated and watched over with especial solicitude. The locals were inclined to take a poor view of the Craigs at first. Cattle ought to have 2 horns, one on either side, curved back. It wasn't right for Cata to have only 1 horn in the middle, slanting forward. Both ships had taken heavy damage. The Nemesis had 1 pinnace berth knocked open, and everybody was glad the Beowulfers hadn't noticed that and gotten a missile inside. The Space Scourge had taken a hit directly on her south pole while lifting out from the planet, and a good deal of the southern part of the ship was sealed off when she came in. The Nemesis was repaired as far as possible and put on off-planet patrol. Then they went to work on the Space Scourge, transferring much of her armament to ground defense, clearing out all the available cargo space, and repairing her hull as far as possible. To repair her completely was a job for a regular shipyard, like Alex Gorham's on Graham. And that was where the work would be done. Oak Valkenhayn would command her on the voyage to and from Graham, since Beowulf. Rask had not only ceased to dislike the man, but was beginning to admire him. He had been a good man once, before ill fortune, which had been only partly of his own making, had overtaken him. He just let himself go and stopped caring. Now he had taken hold of himself again. It had started showing after they had landed on Amaterasu. He had begun to dress more neatly and speak more grammatically, to look and act or like a spaceman and less like a barfly. His men had begun to jump to obey when he gave an order. He had opposed the raid on Beowulf, but that had been the dying struggle of the chicken thief he had been. He had been scared going in. Well, who hadn't been, except a few greenhorns brave with the valor of ignorance. But he had gone in and fought his ship well, and had held his station over the fissionables plant in a hell of bomb. and missile, and he had made sure everybody who had gone down and who was still alive was aboard before he lifted out. He was a Space Viking again. Garvan Spasso wasn't and never would be. He was outraged when he heard that Valkenhayn would take his ship, loaded with much of the loot of the 3 planets, to Graham. He came to Trask, fairly spluttering about it. "You know what'll happen?" he demanded. "He'll space out with that cargo. And that'll be the last any of us'll hear of him again. He'll probably take it to Joyous or Excalibur and buy himself a lordship with it." "Oh, I doubt that, Garvan. A number of our people are going along. Gwot Kirby will be the astrogator. You'd trust him, wouldn't you? And Sir Patrick Morland and Baron Rathmore and Lord Valpry and Rolf Hemmerding." He was silent for a moment, struck by an idea. "Would you be willing to make the trip in the Space Scourge, too?" Spasso would, very decidedly. Trask nodded. "Good. Then we'll be sure nothing crooked is pulled," he said seriously. After Spasso was gone, he got in touch with Baron Rathmore. "See to it that he gets as much money that's due him as possible when you get to Graham. And ask Duke Angus as a favor to give him some meaningless position with a suitably impressive title, Lord Chamberlain of the Ducal Washroom or something. Then he can prime him with misinformation and give him an opportunity to sell it to Omfrey of Glasspythe. Then, of course, he could be contacted to sell Omfrey out to Angus. A couple of times around, and somebody'll stick a knife in him, and then we'll be rid of him for good." They loaded the Space Scourge with gold from Stalgoland, and paintings and statues from the art museums and fabrics and fur, and jewels and porcelains and plate from the markets of Eglansby. They loaded sacks and kegs of specie from Kepra. Most of the Kepra loot wasn't worth hauling to Graham, but it was far enough in advance of their own technologies to be priceless to the Tanith locals. Some of these were learning simple machine operations, and a few were able to handle contragravity vehicles that had been fitted with adequate safety devices. The form. Our slave guards had all become sergeants and lieutenants in an infantry regiment that had been formed, and the King of Tradetown borrowed some to train his own army. Some genius in the machine shop altered a matchlock musket to flintlock and showed the local gunsmiths how to do it. The Craigs continued to thrive after the Space Scourge departed. Several calves were born and seemed to be doing well. The biochemistry of Tanith and Kepper were safely alike. Trask had hopes for them. Every Viking ship had its own carniculture vats, but men tired of carniculture meat, and fresh meat was always in demand. Someday, he hoped, Craig beef would be an item of sale to ships putting in on Tanith, and the long-haired hides might even find a market in the Sword Worlds. They had contragravity scows plying between Rivington and Tradetown regularly now, and air lorries were linking the villages. The boatmen of Tradetown rioted occasionally against this unfair competition, and in Rivington itself, bulldozers and power shovels and manipulators labored, and there was always a rising cloud of dust over the city. There was so much to do, only a trifle under 25 galactic standard hours in a day to do it. There were whole days in which he never thought once of Andray Dunnan, 120. 5 days to Graham and 125 days back. They had long ago passed. Of course, there would be the work of repairing the Space Scourge, the conferences with the investors in the original Tanith adventure, the business of gathering the needed equipment for the new base. Even so, he was beginning to worry a little. Worry about something as far out of his control as the Space Scourge was useless, he knew. He couldn't help it, though. Eve and Harkaman, usually imperturbable, began to be fretful after 270 days had passed. They were relaxing in the living quarters they had fitted out at the top of the spaceport building before retiring. Both sprawled wearily in chairs that had come from one of the better hotels of Eglansby, their drinks between them on a low table, the top of which was inlaid with something that looked like ivory, but wasn't. On the floor, I'd lay the plans for a reaction plant and mass energy converter they would build as soon as the Space Scourge returned with equipment for producing collapsium-plated shielding. Of course, we could go ahead with it, now, Harkaman said. We could tear enough armor off the Lamia to shield any kind of a reaction plant. That was the first time either of them had gotten close to the possibility that the ship mightn't return. Trask laid his cigar in the ashtray. It had come from President Pedros and Pedro's private office, and splashed a little more brandy into his glass. She'll be coming before long. We have enough of our people aboard to make sure nobody else tries to take the ship, and I really believe now that Valkenhayn can be trusted. I do too. I'm not worried about what might happen on the ship, but we don't know what's been happening on Graham. Glassbythe and Didrixburg could have teamed up and jumped Wardshaven before Duke Angus was ready to invade Glassbythe. Boke might be landing the ship in a trap at Wardshaven. Be a sorry-looking trap after it closed on him. That would be the first time in history that a sword world was raided by Space Vikings. Harkaman looked at his half-empty glass, then filled it to the top. It was the same drink he had started with, just as a regiment that has been decimed. Aided and recruited up to strength a few times is still the same regiment. The buzz of the communication screen, one of the few things in the room that hadn't been looted somewhere, interrupted him. They both rose. Harkaman, still carrying his drink, went to put it on. It was a man on duty in the control room overhead, reporting that 2 emergencies had just been detected at 20 light minutes due north of the planet. Harkaman gulped his drink and set down the empty glass. All right. You put out a general alert? Switch anything that comes in over to this screen. He got out his pipe and was packing tobacco into it mechanically. They'll be out of the last micro-jump and about 2 light seconds away in a few minutes. Trask sat down again, saw that his cigarette had burned almost to the tip, and lit a fresh one from it, wishing he could be as calm about it as Harkaman. 3 minutes later, the control tower picked up 2 emergencies at a light second and a half, 1,000 or so miles apart. Then the screen flickered, and Boke Valkenhayn was looking out of it, from the desk in the newly refurbished command room of the Space Scourge. He was a newly refurbished Boke Valkenhayn, too. His heavily braided captain's jacket looked like the work of one of the better tailors on Graham, and on the breast was a large and ornate night star of unfamiliar design, bearing, among other things, the sword and atom symbol of the House of Ward. Prince Trask, Count Harkaman, he greeted. Space Scourge, Tanith, 3,200 hours out of Wardshaven on Graham, Baron Valkenhayn commanding, accompanied by chartered freighter Rosinante Durandal, Captain Morbs, requesting permission and instructions to orbit in. Baron Valkenhayn? Harkaman asked. That's right, Valkenhayn grinned. And I have a vellum scroll the size of a blanket to prove it. I have a whole cargo of scrolls. One says you're Otto, Count Harkaman, and another says you're Admiral of the Royal Navy of Graham. He did it, Trask cried. He made himself King of Graham? That's right. And you're his trusty and well-loved Lucas, Prince Trask, and Viceroy of His Majesty's realm of Tanith. Harkaman bristled at that. A Gehenna, you say? This is our realm of Tanith. Is His Majesty making it worthwhile to accept his sovereignty? Trask asked. That is, beside vellum scrolls, Valkenhayn was still grinning. Wait till we start sending cargo down, and wait till you see what's crammed into the other ship. Did Spasso come back with you? Harkaman asked. Oh no, Sir Garvan Spasso entered the service of His Majesty, King Angus. He is chief of Pull. He's at Glassbythe now, and nobody can call what he's doing there chicken stealing either. Any chickens he steals the whole farm to get them. That didn't sound good. Spasso could make King Angus' name stink all over Glassbythe, or maybe he'd allow Spasso to crush the adherents of Omfrey and then hang him for his oppression of the people. He'd read about somebody who'd done something like that in one of Harkaman's old Ren history books. Baron Rathmore had stayed on Graham, so had Rolf Hemmerding. The rest of the gentlemen adventurers, all with shiny new titles of nobility, had returned. From them, as the 2 ships were getting into orbit, he learned what had happened on Graham since the Nemesis had spaced out. Duke Angus had announced his intention of carrying on with the Tanith adventure, and had started construction of a new ship at the Goram yards. This served plausibly to explain all the activities of preparation for the invasion of Glassbythe, and had deceived Duke Omfrey completely. Omfrey had already started a ship of his own. The entire resources of his duchy were thrown into an effort to get her finished and to space ahead of the one Angus was building. Work was going on frantically on her when the Wardshaven invaders hit Glassbythe. She was now nearing completion as a unit of a Royal Navy. Duke Omfrey had managed to escape to Didrixburg. When Angus troops moved in on the latter duchy, he had escaped again, this time off-planet. He was now eating the bitter bread of exile at the court of his wife's uncle, the king of Haltekler. The Count of New Haven, the Duke of Bigelasport, and the Lord of Northport, all of whom had favored the establishment of a planetary monarchy, had immediately acknowledged Angus as their sovereign. So, with a knife at his throat, had the Duke of Didriksburg. Many other feudal magnates had refused to surrender their sovereignty. That might mean fighting, but Patrick, now Baron Moreland, doubted it. The Space Scourge stopped that, he said. When they heard about the base here and saw what we'd shipped to Graham, they started changing their minds. Only subjects of King Angus will be allowed to invest in the Tanith Adve. Sure. As for accepting King Angus' annexation of Tanith and accepting his sovereignty, that would also be advisable. They would need a Sword World outlet for the loot they took or obtained by barter from other Space Vikings, and until they had adequate industries of their own, they would be dependent on Graham for many things which could not be gotten by raiding. I suppose the king knows I'm not out here for my health or his profit. He asked Lord Valpry during one of the screen conversations as the Space Scourge was getting into orbit. My business out here is Andray Dunnan. Oh, yes, the ward-shaven noble replied. In fact, he told me in so many words that he would be most happy if you sent him his nephew's head in a block of lucite. What Dunnan did touched his honor, too. Sovereign princes never see any humor in things like that. I suppose. He knows that sooner or later Dunnan will try to attack Tanith. If he doesn't, it isn't because I didn't tell him often enough. When you see the defense armament we're bringing, you'll think he does. It was impressive, but nothing to the engineering and industrial equipment. Mining robots for use on the iron moon of Tanith, and normal space transports for the 50,000-mile run between planet and satellite. A collapsed matter producer. Now they could collapsium plate their own shielding. A small, fully robotic steel mill that could be set up and operated on the satellite. Industrial robots and machinery to make machinery. And best of all, 200 engineers and highly skilled technicians. Quite a few industrial baronies on Graham would realize, before long, what they had lost in those men. He wondered what Lord Trask of Traskin would have thought about that. The Prince of Tanith was no longer interested in what happened to Graham. Maybe, if things prospered for the next century or so, his successors would be ruling Graham by viceroy from Tanith. As soon as the Space Scourge was unloaded, she was put on off-planet watch. Harkaman immediately spaced out in the Nemesis while Trask remained behind. They began unloading the Rosinante after setting her down at Rivington Spaceport. After that was done, her officers and crew took a holiday which lasted a month, until the Nemesis returned. Harkaman must have made quick raids on half a dozen planets. None of the cargo he brought back was spectacularly valuable, and he dismissed the whole thing as chicken stealing. But he had lost some men and the ship showed a few fresh scars. A good deal of what was transshipped to the Rosinante was manufactured goods which would compete with merch. And dyes produced on Graham. That load will be a come-down after what the Space Scourge took back, but we didn't want to send the Rosinante back empty, he said. One thing, I had time to do a little reading between stops. The books from the Eglansby Library. Yes, I learned a curious thing about Amaterasu. Do you know why that planet was so extensively colonized by the Federation when there don't seem to be any fisha? Noble ores. The planet produced gadolinium. Gadolinium was essential to hyperdrive engines. The engines of a ship the size of the Nemesis required 50 pounds of it. On the Sword Worlds, it was worth several times its weight in gold. If they still mined it, Amaterasu would repay a second visit. When he mentioned it, Harkaman shrugged. Why should they mine it? There's only one thing it's good for, and you can't run a spaceship on diesel oil. I suppose the mines could be reopened and new refineries built, but we could trade plutonium for gadolinium. They have none of their own. We could charge our own prices for it, and we wouldn't need to tell them what gadolinium sells for on the Sword Worlds. We could, if we could do business with anybody there, after what we did to Eglansby and Stalgoland. Where would we get plutonium? Why do you think the Beowulfers won't have hyperships when they have everything else? Harkaman snapped his fingers. By Satan, that's it. Then he looked at Trask in alarm. Hey, you're not thinking of selling Amaterasu plutonium and Beowulf gadolinium, are you? Why not? We could make a big profit on both ends of the deal. You know what would happen next, don't you? There'd be ships from both planets all over the place in a few years. We want that like we were. on a hole in the head. He couldn't see the objection. Tanith and Amaterasu and Beowulf could work up a very good triangular trade. All three would profit. It wouldn't cost men and ship damage and ammunition either. Maybe a mutual defense alliance, too. Think about it later. There was too much to do here on Tanith at present. There had been mines on the moon of Tanith before the collapse of the Federation. They had been stripped of their equipment afterward, while Tanith was still fighting a rearguard battle against barbarism. But the underground chambers and man-made caverns could still be used, and in time the mines were reopened and the steel mill put in, and eventually ingots of finished steel were coming down by shuttlecraft. In the meantime, the shipyard had been laid out and was taking shape. The Graham ship Queen Flavia, she had been the one found unfinished at Glasspithe, came in 3 months after the Rosinante started back. She must have been finished while Valkenhayn was still in hyperspace. She carried considerable cargo, some of it superfluous but all of it useful. Everybody was investing in the Tanith adventure now, and the money had to be spent for something. Better, she brought close to 1,000 men and women. The leakage of brains and ability from the sword worlds was turning into a flood. Among them was Basil Gorham. Trask remembered him as an insufferable young twerp, but he seemed to be a good shipyard man. He very frankly predicted that in a few years his father's yards at Wardshaven would be idle and all the Tanith ships would be Tanith-built. A junior partner of Lothar F. Fales also came out to establish a branch of the Bank of Wardshaven at Rivington, as soon as the Queen Flavia had discharged her cargo. And passengers, she took on 500 ground fighters from the Lamia, Nemesis, and Space Scourge companies and spaced out on a raiding voyage. While she was gone, the second ship, the one Duke Angus had started at Wardshaven, and King Angus had finished, the Black Star, came in. Trask was slightly incredulous at realizing that she had spaced out from Graham almost exactly 2 years after the Nemesis had departed. He still hadn't any idea where Andray Dunnan was, or what he was doing, or how to find him. The news of the Graham base on Tanith spread slowly, first by the scheduled liners and tramp freighters that linked the Sword Worlds, and then by trading ships and outbound Space Vikings to the old Federation. 2 years and 6 months after the Nemesis had come out of hyperspace to find Boke Valkenhayn and Garvan Spasso on Tanith, the first in. Dependent Space Viking came in to sell a cargo and get repairs. They bought his loot. He had been raiding some planet rather above the level of Kepra and below that of Amaterasu, and healed the wounds his ship had taken getting it. He had been dealing with the Everard family on Hoth, and professed himself much more satisfied with the bargains he had gotten on Tanith, and swore to return. He had never even heard of Andray Dunnan or the Enterprise. It was a Gilgameshire that brought the first news. He had first heard of Gilgameshires. The word was used indiscriminately for a native of or a ship from Gilgamesh, on Graham, from Harkaman and Carford and Van Larch and the others. Since coming to Tanith, he had heard about them from every Space Viking, never in complimentary and rarely in printable terms. Gilgamesh was rated with reservations as a civilized planet, though not on a level with Odin or Isis or Baldur or Marduk or Atone or any of the other worlds which had maintained the culture of the Terran Federation uninterruptedly. Perhaps Gilgamesh deserved more credit. Its people had undergone 2 centuries of darkness and pulled themselves out of it by their bootstraps. They had recovered all the old techniques, up to and including the hyperdrive. They didn't raid, they traded. They had religious objections to violence, though they kept these within sensible limits, and were able and willing to fight with fanatical ferocity in defense of their home planet. About a century before, there had been a 5-ship Viking raid on Gilgamesh. 1 ship had returned and had been sold for scrap after reaching a friendly base. Their ships went everywhere to trade, and wherever they traded a few of them usually settled, and where they settled they may. Money, sending most of it home. Their society seemed to be a loose theosocialism, and their religion an absurd potpourri of most of the major monotheisms of the Federation period, plus doctrinal and ritualistic innovations of their own. Aside from their propensity for sharp trading, their bigoted refusal to regard anybody not of their creed as more than half human, and the maze of dietary and other taboos in which they hid from social contact with others made them generally disliked. After their ship had gotten into orbit, 3 of them came down to do business. The captain and his exec wore long coats, almost knee-length, buttoned to the throat, and small white caps like forage caps. The third, one of their priests, wore a robe with a cowl, and the symbol of their religion, a blue triangle in a white circle, on his breast. They all wore beard that hung down from their cheeks, with their chins and upper lips shaved. They all had the same righteous, disapproving faces. They all refused refreshments of any sort, and they sat uneasily, as though fearing contamination from the heathens who had sat in their chairs before them. They had a mixed cargo of general merchandise picked up here and there on subcivilized planets, in which nobody on Tanith was interested. They also had some good stuff, vegetable amber and flame bird plumes from Irminsul, ivory or something very like it from somewhere else, diamonds and other organic opals and Zarathustra sunstones. They also had some platinum. They wanted machinery, especially contragravity engines and robots. Dealing with Gilgameshire, the trouble was, they wanted to haggle. Haggling, it seemed, was the Gilgamish planetary sport. Have you ever heard of a Space Viking ship? Aimed the Enterprise? He asked them at the 7th or 8th impasse in the bargaining. She bears a crescent light blue on black. Her captain's name is Andray Dunnan. A ship so named with such a device raided Chermosh more than a year ago, the priest supercargo said. Some of our people tarry on Chermosh to trade. This ship sacked the city in which they were. Some of them lost heavily in world's goods. That's a pity, the Gilgamish priest shrugged. It is as Yah the Almighty wills, he said, then brightened slightly. The Chermoshers are heathens and worshippers of false gods. The Space Vikings looted their temple and destroyed it utterly. They carried away the graven images and abominations. Our people bore witness that there was much wailing and lamentation among the idolaters. So that was the first entry on the big board. It covered, optimistically, the whole of one wall in his office, and for some time that one chalked note about the raid on Chermosh, and the date, as nearly as it could be approximated, looked very lonely on it. The captain of the Black Star brought back material for a couple more. He had put in on several planets known to be temporarily occupied by Space Vikings, to barter loot, give his men some time off ship, and make inquiries, and he had names for a couple of planets raided by the Blue Crescent ship. One was only 6 months old, the way news filtered about in the old Federation that was practically hot off the stove. The owner-captain of the Alborak had something to add when he brought his ship in 6 months later. He sipped his drink slowly, as though he had limited himself to one and wanted to make it last as long as possible. Almost 2 years ago on Jagannath, he said, the Enterprise was on orbit there, getting some light repairs. I met the man a few times. Looks just like those pictures, but he's wearing a small pointed beard now. He'd sold a lot of loot. General merchandise, precious and semi-precious stones, a lot of carved and inlaid furniture that looked as though it had come from some Neobarb king's palace, and some temple stuff. Buddhist, there were a couple of big gold daibutses. His crew were standing drinks. For all comers, some of them were pretty dark above the collar, as though they'd been on a hot star planet not too long before. And he had a lot of Imhotep furs to sell, simply fabulous stuff. What kind of repairs? Combat damage? That was my impression. He spaced out a little over 100 hours after I came in company with another ship, the Starhopper, Captain Teodor Vagn. The talk was that they were making a 2-ship aid somewhere. The captain of the Alborak thought for a moment. One other thing. He was buying ammunition, everything from pistol cartridges to hellburners. And he was buying all the air and water recycling equipment and all the carniculture and hydroponic equipment he could get. That was something to know. He thanked the Space Viking and then asked, did he know at the time that I'm out here hunting for him? If he did, nobody else. On Jagannath did. I didn't hear about it myself till 6 months afterward. That evening he played off the recording he had made of the conversation for Harkaman and Valkenhayn and Carford and some of the others. Somebody instantly said, that temple stuff came from Chermosh. They're Buddhists there. That checks with the Gilgameshire's story. He got the furs on Imhotep. He traded for them, Harkaman said. Nobody gets anything off Imhotep by raiding. The planet's in the middle of a glaciation. The land surface down to the 50th parallel is iced over solid. There is one city, 10 or 15,000, and the rest of the population is scattered around in settlements of a couple of hundred all along the face of the glaciers. They're all hunters and trappers. They have some contragravity, and when a ship comes in, they spread the news by radio and everybody brings his ers to town. They use telescope sights and everybody over 10 years old can hit a man in the head at 500 yards. And big weapons are no good, they're too well dispersed, so the only way to get anything out of them is to trade for it. I think I know where he was, Alvin Carford said. On Imhotep, silver is a monetary metal. On Agni, they use silver for sewer pipe. Agni is a hot star planet, class B Thra. Sun, and on Agni they are tough and they have good weapons. That could be where the Enterprise took that combat damage. That started an argument as to whether he'd gone to Chermosh first. It was sure that he had gone to Agni and then Imhotep. Gwat Kirby tried to figure both courses. Doesn't tell us anything either way, he said at length. Chermosh is a way off to the side from Agni and Imhotep in either case. Well, he does have a ace somewhere, and it's not on any Terra-type planet, Valkenhayn said. Otherwise, what would he want with all that air-and water and hydroponic and carniculture stuff? The old Federation area was full of non-Terra-type planets, and why should anybody bother going to any of them? Any planet that wasn't oxygen atmosphere, 6,000 to 8,000 miles in diameter, and within a narrow surface temperature range, wasn't worth waste. In time on, but a planet like that, if one had the survival equipment, would make a wonderful hideout. What sort of a captain is this Teodor Vagn? He asked. A good one, Harkaman said promptly. He has a nasty streak, sadistic, but he knows his business and he has a good ship and a well-trained crew. You think he and Dunnan have teamed up, don't you? I think now that he has a base, Dunnan is getting a fleet together. He'll know we're after him by now, Van Larch said. And he knows where we are, and that puts him one up on us.